Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Sheriff Cass Mercer had always believed that West Texas kept its secrets buried deep beneath layers of sand and silence, hidden in the endless expanse of desert where the horizon stretched so far it seemed to curve away from reality itself. After 16 years serving Ochoa County, a territory of sun-bleached plains and scattered ranch communities where the population density measured less than 2 people per square mile, she thought she understood the particular brand of isolation that shaped life in this corner of Texas. The desert was unforgiving but predictable, dangerous but honest in its dangers. People died from heat exposure, vehicle accidents on lonely highways, and the occasional dispute that turned violent when alcohol and old grudges mixed during long summer nights. The crimes she investigated were straightforward, born from desperation or stupidity rather than calculation. Domestic situations that exploded after months of tension, livestock theft that funded drug habits, and the rare homicide that usually involved someone everyone in the county already knew and suspected. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what began on a morning in late September 2019, when a rancher's call about an abandoned caravan would lead her into a darkness that had been festering in Ochoa County for decades, hidden in plain sight among the very people she had sworn to protect. The call came in at 6:47 in the morning, just as Mercer was finishing her first cup of coffee and reviewing incident reports from the previous night's patrol shifts. The department was small, just herself and 4 deputies covering nearly 3,000 square miles of territory, which meant that quiet nights were celebrated and busy ones could stretch resources dangerously thin. The voice on the other end belonged to Vernon Hayes, a third-generation cattle rancher whose family had worked the same land since the 1920s, back when West Texas still held the promise of prosperity for those willing to endure its harshness. Vernon was normally a man of few words, someone who called the sheriff's department only when absolutely necessary and handled most problems on his own land with the self-reliance that defined his generation. The tremor in his voice was unusual enough to make Mercer sit up straighter in her chair, already reaching for her duty belt before he finished his first sentence. "Sheriff Mercer, I got something out here on my southeast section that ain't right," Vernon said without preamble, his West Texas drawl thickened by what sounded like genuine distress. "Found an old caravan, one of them vintage Airstream trailers. Been sitting out past the stock tanks for God knows how long. Thought it was just some abandoned junk at first, but when I looked inside through the window, well, you need to get out here and see this yourself." Mercer felt the familiar tightness in her stomach that came with calls that promised to complicate an otherwise manageable day. In rural law enforcement, something that ain't right could range from illegal dumping to discovered drug operations, but the specific mention of an abandoned caravan in the middle of Vernon's property raised immediate questions about how it had gotten there and why he sounded so unsettled by what he had seen inside. She asked him the obvious questions while already knowing his answers would be insufficient until she saw the situation firsthand. What exactly had he seen through the window? Vernon's response was careful, as if he was reluctant to describe what his eyes had registered, but his mind was still trying to process. "Something wrapped up in what looks like old blankets or tarps, Sheriff. Could be nothing. Could be what I think it might be. Either way, it don't belong on my land, and I sure as hell didn't give nobody permission to leave it there." The drive to Vernon's ranch took 35 minutes along Highway 285, the 2-lane road that served as Ochoa County's primary artery, connecting the county seat of Marfa to the scattered communities and ranch properties that dotted the landscape like islands in an ocean of sand and scrub brush. The September morning was already heating up, the sun climbing into a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly, promising another day where temperatures would push past 95 degrees by noon. Mercer had called Deputy Rowan Tate to meet her at Vernon's property, needing a second set of eyes and someone to help process whatever scene they were about to encounter. Tate was her most experienced deputy, a former Marine who had served 2 tours in Iraq before returning to his hometown of Marfa and joining the sheriff's department 5 years earlier. He had the kind of steady competence that made him valuable in situations that required both physical capability and good judgment, qualities that were about to be tested in ways neither of them could anticipate. Vernon's ranch headquarters sat at the end of a gravel road that branched off the highway, marked by a weathered metal gate and a cattle guard that rattled beneath the patrol vehicle's tires. The main house was a low adobe structure that had been expanded over generations, surrounded by corrals, outbuildings, and the massive water tanks that were essential infrastructure in country where rainfall averaged less than 15 inches annually. Vernon was waiting by his truck when Mercer arrived, dressed in the eternal uniform of West Texas ranchers: faded Wranglers, scuffed boots, a work shirt that had seen better decades, and a sweat-stained hat that shaded a face weathered by 60 years of sun and wind. His border collie, Cisco, sat in the truck bed with unusual stillness, which Mercer noted as significant since the dog was normally eager to investigate any visitors to the property. Animals often sensed wrong situations before humans fully registered them, and Cisco's reluctance to approach suggested the dog had already made his assessment of whatever waited out in the southeast section. "Appreciate you coming out so quick, Sheriff," Vernon said, as Mercer stepped out of her vehicle, his voice carrying the careful formality that older ranchers used when dealing with law enforcement, a mixture of respect for the badge and innate distrust of government interference in private affairs. "Didn't want to disturb nothing out there, but I couldn't just leave it without reporting. That caravan's been sitting out past the old windmill for a while, I'd guess. Haven't run cattle in that section for near about 6 months, so it could have been there all that time without me noticing." Mercer exchanged glances with Deputy Tate, who had arrived moments after her and was already retrieving his evidence kit and camera from his patrol vehicle. The fact that the caravan could have been on Vernon's property for months without discovery wasn't surprising given the size of his spread and the vast sections that might go unvisited for extended periods. But it raised immediate questions about how someone had managed to tow a caravan that far onto private land without being noticed, and what purpose they had for leaving it in such a remote location. "How'd you find it today?" Mercer asked, as she checked her service weapon and retrieved her own evidence kit. Vernon gestured toward the distant horizon where heat waves were already beginning to shimmer above the desert floor. "Was checking fence lines in preparation for moving a herd to fresh pasture. Saw sun reflecting off metal near the old windmill, figured someone had dumped trash. When I drove closer to haul it away, that's when I realized it was a whole damn caravan. And that's when I saw what's inside through the window." He paused, his weathered face troubled by something more than just the inconvenience of unwanted property on his land. "Sheriff, I've been working this country my whole life, seen plenty of dead things. This feels different. This feels deliberate." They took Vernon's ATV to reach the caravan, traveling along rough ranch roads that were little more than tire tracks across hardpan desert. The land here was beautiful in its starkness, all pale sand and dark rock formations, studded with creosote bushes and the occasional mesquite tree twisted into tortured shapes by constant wind. The sky overhead was enormous, that particular quality of desert sky that made humans feel appropriately small and insignificant in the face of geological time and cosmic scale. The old windmill Vernon had mentioned stood about 3 miles from the ranch headquarters, a rusted structure that no longer functioned, but served as a landmark in country where features were few and widely scattered. As they approached, Mercer could see the caravan sitting perhaps 200 yards beyond the windmill, positioned in a shallow depression that would make it nearly invisible from any distance, unless someone knew exactly where to look, or happened to be in exactly the right position to catch sunlight reflecting off its aluminum skin. The caravan was a vintage Airstream, probably from the 1960s based on its streamlined shape and rivet pattern, the kind that had become fashionable again in recent years as people restored them for recreational use or converted them into mobile offices and tiny homes. This one had clearly been abandoned for some time, its once bright aluminum exterior now oxidized to a dull gray, covered with dust and the streaked evidence of years spent exposed to West Texas weather. The tires were flat and partially buried in sand, and the tow hitch showed rust damage that suggested it hadn't been moved in years. Someone had gone to considerable effort to get the caravan to this specific location, towing it miles from the nearest road and positioning it deliberately in a depression that provided natural concealment from casual observation. The amount of planning required for that effort suggested this wasn't random dumping or someone abandoning a broken vehicle. This was intentional placement for purposes that were about to become disturbingly clear. Mercer approached the caravan carefully, while Deputy Tate circled around to check the opposite side and photographed the scene from multiple angles. The windows were covered from the inside with what appeared to be aluminum foil or some other reflective material, preventing anyone from seeing into the interior while also serving to deflect heat and maintain whatever conditions existed inside. One window on the east side had a small gap in the covering where Vernon had managed to peek through, the opening barely large enough to see anything but apparently sufficient for him to register what had prompted his call to the sheriff's department. Mercer pulled a flashlight from her belt and positioned herself at the window, angling the beam through the gap to illuminate the caravan's interior. What she saw in that narrow cone of light made her breath catch, and her free hand instinctively moved to her weapon, even though logic immediately told her that whatever threat had existed here was long past. The interior of the caravan had been converted into something that bore no resemblance to its original recreational purpose. The built-in furniture and fixtures had been removed, leaving an empty shell that had been carefully prepared for a purpose that became apparent as Mercer's eyes adjusted to the darkness. The floor was covered with layers of heavy plastic sheeting, the kind used in construction or by painters to protect surfaces, carefully taped and sealed to create a contained environment. In the center of this plastic-lined space lay what Vernon had described as something wrapped in blankets, but what Mercer's trained eyes immediately recognized as a body wrapped in a sleeping bag and secured with multiple layers of duct tape. The wrapping was methodical and complete, creating a sealed cocoon that had presumably contained decomposition odors and fluids for however long the body had been here. But most disturbing were the items arranged around the wrapped body with what appeared to be ritualistic care. Photographs, documents, and personal effects laid out in a pattern that suggested meaning and intention rather than random disposal. "Rowan," Mercer called to her deputy, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline now coursing through her system. "I need you to photograph everything before we open this scene up. We're looking at a body carefully concealed and deliberately arranged. This isn't a dumping, this is presentation." Tate moved efficiently to document the exterior of the caravan from every angle, including details that might prove significant later. Tire tracks that were still faintly visible despite wind and weather, disturbed vegetation patterns that indicated the path used to bring the caravan to its current location, and the specific positioning in the depression that had kept it hidden for so long. Mercer continued her examination through the window, noting additional details that painted a picture of meticulous planning and execution. The caravan's door was secured from the outside with a heavy padlock, suggesting whoever had placed the body inside had wanted to ensure it wouldn't be easily discovered. The aluminum foil covering the windows was applied from inside, indicating the person had worked from within the caravan before sealing it and locking themselves out. Vernon had maintained a respectful distance while Mercer and Tate worked, standing beside his ATV with Cisco still sitting uneasily in the back. When Mercer walked over to update him on what they had found, his expression showed no surprise, only a deepening of the trouble that had been evident from the beginning. "I figured it was something like that," he said quietly, looking past her toward the caravan as if he could see through its aluminum walls to the scene contained within. "Sheriff, I need to tell you something about this section of my property. That windmill, the area around it, there's always been stories. My grandfather used to say strange things happened out here, that the land had bad memories. I always figured it was just old-timer talk, superstition from men who spent too much time alone under the sun. But now I'm wondering if maybe there was truth in what he said." The statement raised immediate questions in Mercer's mind about what history this land held, and whether the body in the caravan was connected to something older and darker than a single isolated crime. But those questions would have to wait until they had processed the immediate scene and identified the victim. She told Vernon he would need to remain available for a complete statement, but that he could return to his ranch headquarters while the sheriff's department worked the scene. She also made it clear that the entire southeast section of his property was now a crime scene and would be off limits until their investigation was complete. Vernon accepted this with the resignation of someone who had expected no other outcome, climbing onto his ATV and driving away with one final look back at the caravan that sat like a time capsule in the desert, holding secrets that were about to spill into the present day. Deputy Tate had finished his photographic documentation and was now examining the padlock that secured the caravan's door. "Sheriff, this lock is relatively new," he reported, pointing to the brass mechanism that showed minimal weathering despite the caravan's obvious age. Maybe 3 years old at most. Someone has been maintaining security on this site. The observation confirmed what Mercer had already suspected. The caravan hadn't been abandoned decades ago and forgotten. Someone had placed it here recently, within the past few years, and had taken care to ensure it remained sealed until they were ready for it to be discovered, or until time and nature eventually revealed its contents. The question of why now, why had the timing worked out so that Vernon found it today after months of it sitting undiscovered, would be something to consider later. For now, they needed to get inside and begin the grim work of processing what appeared to be a carefully staged crime scene. Mercer made the decision to cut the padlock rather than spend time trying to find keys that might not exist or might have been destroyed after the caravan was sealed. Tate used bolt cutters from his evidence kit, and the lock gave way with a metallic snap that seemed unnaturally loud in the desert silence. The door swung open on hinges that protested with high-pitched squeals, and immediately the smell hit them, the sweet, sickening odor of advanced decomposition that every law enforcement officer learned to recognize and never quite forgot. Despite the careful wrapping and plastic containment, enough decomposition gases had escaped over time to create an atmosphere inside the caravan that was nearly overwhelming. Mercer and Tate both pulled on respirators before entering, knowing from experience that the smell was the least of their concerns when dealing with biological contamination from decomposed remains. The interior of the caravan confirmed everything Mercer had observed through the window, but seeing it in full perspective made the scene even more disturbing. Someone had spent considerable time preparing this space, converting a vintage recreational vehicle into a climate-controlled tomb that had preserved the body and its surrounding materials far better than if it had been left exposed to the elements. The plastic sheeting that lined every surface had been applied with professional-level care, sealed at every seam to create an envelope that contained both body and evidence. The wrapped remains lay in the exact center of this prepared space, positioned with the kind of precision that suggested ritual significance. And arranged around the body in a perfect circle were items that told a story Mercer was only beginning to piece together. Photographs of people she didn't recognize, newspaper clippings dating back decades, and what appeared to be personal documents including birth certificates and identification cards that had been carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. "Sheriff, look at this," Tate said from where he was examining the items arranged around the body. He pointed to one of the plastic sleeve documents, a birth certificate that showed water damage and age, but was still legible. The name on the certificate was Delpha Crow, born in Ochoa County in 1952, with parents listed as Martha and James Crow. Mercer felt something cold settle in her chest as she recognized the surname. The Crow family had been prominent in Ochoa County during the oil boom years of the 1950s and 60s, owning several successful businesses in Marfa before the family's fortunes declined during the economic troubles of the 1980s. But she also remembered something else about the name Delpha Crow. It had come up during her first year as sheriff when she was reviewing old case files, listed as a missing person from 1975 whose disappearance had never been solved. The connection between a missing person from 44 years ago and a body in a sealed caravan on Vernon Hayes' property raised questions that made Mercer's investigation instincts fire on all cylinders. She moved carefully around the wrapped remains, photographing every item that had been arranged in that careful circle while Tate documented the body's wrapping and position. The photographs showed people in various settings, some clearly from the 1960s and 70s, based on clothing and photographic quality, others more recent. Several showed a woman who might have been Delpha Crow at various ages, though without confirmation it was impossible to be certain. The newspaper clippings were from the Marfa Sentinel, the local paper that had served Ochoa County for over a century, with articles about various events and people spanning decades. Some clippings seemed random, but others had been marked or highlighted as if to draw attention to specific passages or individuals mentioned in the text. Most disturbing were the handwritten notes that had been included among the arranged items. Written on yellowed paper in careful cursive script, they appeared to be letters or diary entries that detailed observations and thoughts about people and events in Ochoa County. The content was fragmentary, difficult to understand without more context, but certain phrases jumped out with uncomfortable clarity. The truth about what happened that summer. Justice delayed but not forgotten. They thought the desert would keep their secrets forever. The note suggested that whoever had prepared this caravan tomb had been trying to tell a story or preserve evidence of something they believed needed to be revealed. The question of whether the wrapped body was Delpha Crow, and whether she had prepared this scene herself before her death, or whether someone else had created this memorial to her, added layers of complexity to an already disturbing situation. "Rowan, I want every item cataloged before we move anything," Mercer instructed, pulling out her phone to call the county medical examiner. "And I need you to start photographing those newspaper articles and handwritten notes in detail. Whatever this is, someone went to extreme effort to preserve it and arrange it for discovery. We need to understand what story they were trying to tell." As Tate moved methodically through the documentation process, Mercer stepped outside the caravan to make her calls, grateful for the fresh air despite its heat. She contacted Dr. Raymond Martinez, the medical examiner who served Ochoa County and 3 surrounding counties, and explained what they had found. Dr. Martinez estimated he could be on scene within 2 hours, traveling from his office in Alpine where he maintained the regional morgue and examination facilities. She also called her office to request that Deputy Sarah Chen, who had training in evidence processing and cold case investigation, be sent to the scene as additional support. The morning was advancing toward noon, the sun climbing higher and the temperature inside the caravan becoming dangerously hot despite the door being open. Mercer and Tate took turns working inside for short periods, documenting and photographing while avoiding heat exhaustion. The desert around them was silent except for the occasional call of a raven and the sound of wind moving through creosote bushes. It was the kind of silence that felt ancient and patient, as if the land itself was waiting to see what secrets would be revealed from the aluminum tomb that had sat undisturbed on Vernon Hayes' property for years. Mercer found herself looking out at the surrounding landscape, noting landmarks and calculating sight lines, wondering how someone had managed to bring the caravan to this location without being observed, and how long it would have taken to prepare the interior and arrange the body with its surrounding evidence. Deputy Chen arrived first, driving one of the department's four-wheel drive vehicles that was better suited to rough ranch roads than standard patrol cars. At 32, she was the youngest member of Mercer's small department, but brought skills that were increasingly valuable in modern law enforcement. Advanced training in digital evidence collection, experience with cold case investigation techniques, and a methodical approach to processing complex scenes. Chen took one look at the caravan and the materials spread around it and immediately began setting up a more organized evidence processing system, creating numbered markers for each item and establishing a documentation protocol that would stand up to scrutiny in whatever prosecution might eventually result from this investigation. Her efficiency allowed Mercer to step back and consider the bigger picture of what they were dealing with, moving from the tactical processing of a crime scene to the strategic investigation of what the scene was telling them about events that might stretch back decades. The body itself couldn't be unwrapped or examined in detail until Dr. Martinez arrived with proper equipment and the legal authority to handle human remains. But even wrapped as it was, certain observations could be made about its condition and the care with which it had been preserved. The sleeping bag and duct tape wrapping was professional in quality, suggesting someone with either training or experience in handling deceased bodies. The plastic sheeting that lined the caravan and surrounded the body had prevented insect access and limited decomposition despite the desert heat, indicating knowledge of preservation techniques. Most significantly, the positioning of the body and the arrangement of items around it showed a level of planning and intention that elevated this beyond a simple murder and disposal case. Someone had wanted this body found eventually, had wanted the surrounding evidence preserved and presented in a way that told a specific story. The question that dominated Mercer's thinking as she surveyed the scene was, what story and why had it been hidden in a sealed caravan in the middle of Vernon Hayes' property? Dr. Raymond Martinez arrived at the scene 2 hours after Mercer's call, driving a white county van equipped with the tools and equipment necessary for field examination of human remains. Martinez was a careful man in his late 50s who had served as Ochoa County's medical examiner for nearly 20 years, handling everything from routine autopsies to complex forensic investigations with the same methodical precision. He had seen enough death in its various forms to maintain professional detachment while still treating the deceased with appropriate dignity, a balance that Mercer appreciated, given how easily some medical examiners could become either too clinical or too emotionally invested in their cases. As Martinez approached the caravan with his equipment, Mercer briefed him on what they had found and the questions that were already emerging about the identity of the remains and the purpose behind their elaborate presentation. Sheriff Mercer, this is unlike anything I've encountered in 2 decades of work in West Texas, Martinez said after spending 30 minutes examining the scene without disturbing the wrapped body. The level of preparation, the environmental controls created by the plastic sheeting and sealed caravan, the careful arrangement of materials around the remains. This wasn't done by someone unfamiliar with preservation techniques. Whoever prepared this body knew exactly how to maintain it for long-term storage in extreme conditions. He knelt beside the wrapped form, using gloved hands to carefully examine the duct tape and sleeping bag without disrupting the wrapping. Based on the deterioration of the tape adhesive and the condition of the sleeping bag material, I would estimate this body has been here for at least 3 years, possibly longer. The sealed environment slowed decomposition significantly, but there's still extensive breakdown of soft tissue. We won't know much more until we can unwrap and examine the remains in controlled conditions at the morgue." Mercer watched Martinez work, noting his observations while her own mind was already moving ahead to the investigation that would follow once they had confirmed the identity of the remains. If this was indeed Delpha Crow, as the birth certificate and other documents suggested, then they were looking at a missing person case from 1975 that had somehow resulted in her body being carefully preserved and hidden in a vintage caravan on Vernon Hayes's property decades after her disappearance. The timeline raised immediate questions about where the body had been kept between 1975 and whenever it was placed in the caravan, who had prepared this elaborate memorial or crime scene, and what the carefully arranged documents and photographs were meant to communicate about events that had occurred 44 years ago. The investigation was expanding from a single discovered body into something that might touch on decades of Ochoa County history, potentially implicating people who were still alive and members of the community Mercer served. Deputy Tate had been systematically photographing and cataloging the items arranged around the body, creating a detailed inventory that would allow them to piece together whatever narrative the materials were intended to convey. Among the newspaper clippings, he found articles about various events in Ochoa County during the 1960s and 70s. The oil boom that had briefly brought prosperity to the region, the construction of new schools and public facilities funded by mineral rights revenues, prominent families who had dominated local business and politics during those years, and eventually the economic decline that had hollowed out the county when oil prices collapsed in the early 1980s. Several articles mentioned the Crow family specifically, describing James Crow as a successful businessman who owned a construction company and served on various civic boards, and Martha Crow as a prominent figure in local social organizations and church activities. There were no articles about Delpha Crow's disappearance, which struck Mercer as significant given that a missing person from a prominent family should have generated newspaper coverage. "Rowan, when you get back to the office, I want you to pull every case file we have on missing persons from Ochoa County between 1970 and 1980, Mercer instructed, as Tate carefully placed another photographed document into an evidence bag. "I want to know exactly what was reported about Delpha Crow's disappearance and what investigation was conducted at the time. I also want you to find out who was serving as sheriff in 1975 and whether any of those deputies are still alive and available to interview." Tate nodded, making notes on his evidence log while continuing to process the materials. The handwritten notes were particularly intriguing, offering fragmentary glimpses into someone's thoughts and observations about events in Ochoa County. One note in particular caught Mercer's attention, written in that careful cursive script on paper that had yellowed with age. They all knew what happened that summer at the construction site, but nobody would speak against James Crow. The money was too good and the consequences too severe, but Delpha saw everything, and she couldn't stay silent forever. The reference to a construction site, and James Crow suggested that whatever had led to Delpha's disappearance might have involved her father's business activities, possibly something illegal or unethical that Delpha had witnessed and threatened to reveal. The note's suggestion that multiple people knew about this incident but remained silent out of fear or financial interest painted a picture of conspiracy and cover-up that implicated not just James Crow but potentially many other members of the Ochoa County community during the 1970s. If the body in the caravan was indeed Delpha, and if she had been killed to prevent her from revealing whatever she knew about her father's activities, then the person who had prepared this elaborate presentation might have been trying to finally bring that truth to light decades after the original crime. The question of who that person was and why they had chosen this particular method and timing added additional complexity to an already intricate investigation. Martinez completed his preliminary examination and authorized the removal of the body to the county morgue, where he could conduct a proper autopsy in controlled conditions. The process of extracting the wrapped remains from the caravan required careful coordination to avoid disturbing evidence while also maintaining the dignity of handling human remains. Deputy Tate and Dr. Martinez worked together to place the body on a gurney, securing it for transport, while Mercer supervised and ensured that every step was documented photographically and in written notes. As they loaded the remains into Martinez's van, Mercer found herself looking back at the caravan sitting in its shallow depression, aluminum skin gleaming in the afternoon sun, and wondering how many times someone had visited this location over the years to check on the body or add to the arranged materials. The image of someone driving miles into Vernon Hayes's property, unlocking the padlock, and spending time in that hot metal tomb with decomposing remains was deeply disturbing, suggesting a level of commitment or obsession that went beyond simple evidence preservation. With the body removed, and most of the physical evidence catalogued, Mercer made the decision to have the entire caravan transported to a secure facility where it could be processed more thoroughly in controlled conditions. The caravan itself was evidence, not just a container for other materials, and she wanted forensic specialists to examine every surface for fingerprints, DNA, and any other traces that might identify who had prepared the scene. Deputy Tate arranged for a heavy-duty wrecker to respond to the location, which would require at least 2 hours given the remote position and difficult terrain. In the meantime, Mercer decided to drive back to town and begin the investigation into Ochoa County's records from 1975, looking for any documentation of Delpha Crow's disappearance and the investigation that had followed. The drive back to Marfa gave her time to process what they had discovered and begin formulating the questions that would drive the investigation forward. The Ochoa County Sheriff's Department occupied a low brick building on the main street of Marfa, a structure that had been built in the 1950s and showed its age in cracked floor tiles and temperamental air conditioning. The building also housed the county jail, a small facility with 8 cells that served to hold prisoners awaiting trial or serving short sentences for misdemeanor offenses. Mercer's office was a cramped space with filing cabinets that contained decades of case files, a desk perpetually covered with paperwork, and windows that looked out onto the street where tourists now outnumbered locals during peak seasons. Marfa had undergone a strange transformation over the past 2 decades, evolving from a dying West Texas town into an unlikely arts destination that attracted visitors from around the world who came to see minimalist art installations and experience what they imagined was authentic desert culture. The transformation had brought some economic vitality back to the town, but it had also created tensions between longtime residents and the newcomers who had different values and expectations about what Marfa should be. Mercer pulled case files from the storage room, a windowless space where decades of paper records moldered in boxes stacked floor to ceiling. The filing system was inconsistent, having been maintained by multiple sheriffs and administrative staff over the years with varying levels of organization and attention to detail. She eventually located a box labeled Missing Persons 1970 to 1979 and carried it back to her office, spreading the files across her desk and beginning the tedious process of reviewing each case. Most were straightforward. Teenagers who had run away and were later found, adults who had left town to escape debt or domestic problems, and transients who had passed through Ochoa County and were reported missing by family members who eventually learned they had moved on to other locations. But there was no file for Delpha Crow, no missing person report, no investigation records. Nothing that indicated her disappearance had ever been officially reported to or investigated by the Sheriff's Department. The absence of any official record was significant and disturbing, suggesting that Delpha's disappearance had either never been reported or had been deliberately removed from county records. Mercer moved to the older filing cabinets that contained incident reports and daily logs from the 1970s, looking for any mention of the Crow family or situations that might relate to Delpha. What she found in the logs from June and July 1975 was revealing in what it didn't contain. There were no calls to the Crow residence, no request for welfare checks, no investigation notes about a missing person, nothing that would indicate the sheriff's department had any involvement with the family during the period when Delpha should have been reported missing. The gap in records could have been innocent, simply reflecting poor documentation practices during that era, but combined with the handwritten notes found in the caravan suggesting a cover-up, it painted a more sinister picture of official complicity in suppressing information about whatever had happened to Delpha Crow. The sheriff serving Ochoa County in 1975 had been Walter Briggs, a man whose name Mercer recognized from old photographs displayed in the department's hallway showing the lineage of sheriffs dating back to the county's founding. Briggs had served from 1968 to 1988, a 20-year tenure that had seen him through the oil boom years when the department expanded, and then the subsequent decline when budget cuts forced reductions in staff and resources. Mercer knew that Briggs had died in the early 2000s, taking whatever knowledge he might have had about the Crow case to his grave. But some of his deputies from that era might still be alive and available to interview, though finding them and getting them to speak honestly about events from 44 years ago would be challenging. People who had remained silent about a crime for decades rarely decided to suddenly cooperate with investigations, especially if speaking honestly might implicate them in wrongdoing or expose them to legal consequences. Deputy Tate returned from the scene with the last loads of evidence as afternoon was transitioning into evening, the boxes of photographed and cataloged materials filling one corner of the evidence room. He had also stopped at the county clerk's office to pull property records for the Hayes Ranch, looking for any historical information that might explain why someone had chosen that specific location for the caravan. What he found added another layer to the investigation. Vernon Hayes's property had been purchased in 1982 from the estate of James Crow, who had owned several thousand acres of land in Ochoa County during the peak of his business success. The land had been sold after James's death to settle debts and provide for his widow Martha, who had moved away from Marfa shortly after the sale and whose current whereabouts were unknown. The connection between the Hayes property and the Crow family meant that whoever had placed the caravan there had chosen land that had once belonged to Delpha's father, suggesting symbolic significance or practical knowledge about the property's isolation and lack of regular observation. "Sheriff, this is starting to look like someone was settling old scores or trying to expose a decades-old crime," Tate observed as they reviewed the property records together. If Delpha Crow was killed because of something involving her father's business, and if her body was hidden for decades, then someone with knowledge of that crime has now decided to bring it to light by creating this elaborate presentation on land that used to belong to the family. The question is who, and why now after all these years? Mercer nodded, already considering the possibilities. The person who had prepared the caravan scene had to be someone with direct knowledge of what had happened to Delpha in 1975, which meant they were either involved in her death or close enough to people who were involved to know details that had never been made public. The fact that they had waited decades before revealing this information suggested either fear of consequences that had only recently been removed, or a decision triggered by some recent event that made them feel compelled to act. Dr. Martinez called later that evening with preliminary findings from his examination of the remains. "Sheriff Mercer, I can confirm the body is female, approximate age at time of death between 20 and 30 years old, height consistent with average for that demographic. The preservation is good enough that I was able to recover some tissue samples for DNA analysis, though results will take several weeks. More significant is what I found when I unwrapped the remains, evidence of severe trauma to the skull, specifically blunt force injuries consistent with being struck multiple times with a heavy object. This was clearly a homicide, and based on the injury pattern, it was a violent and sustained attack." Martinez paused, and Mercer could hear papers rustling as he consulted his notes. "There's something else, Sheriff." The body was carefully washed and prepared before being wrapped, with particular attention to removing trace evidence. Whoever did this had knowledge of forensic procedures and wanted to minimize the chance of linking physical evidence to themselves or others involved in the death. The confirmation that they were investigating a homicide rather than a natural death or accident formalized the investigation's direction and elevated its priority. Mercer would need to request additional resources from the Texas Rangers if the case expanded beyond what her small department could handle effectively. She also needed to identify surviving family members or associates of the Crow family who might be willing to discuss events from 1975, though she suspected that after 44 years, most people would claim faulty memory or simply refuse to cooperate with questions about a prominent family's dark secrets. The handwritten notes found in the caravan suggested that multiple people in the community had known about criminal activity involving James Crow's construction business, but proving that knowledge and getting anyone to admit their complicity or silence would be extremely difficult without hard evidence beyond cryptic notes left by an unknown author. Mercer spent the evening reviewing newspaper archives from the Marfa Sentinel, using the library's microfilm collection to examine issues from 1975 and surrounding years. What she found reinforced the pattern of silence around Delpha Crow's disappearance. There were no articles about a missing person investigation, no family appeals for information, no coverage whatsoever of Delpha after mid-1975. The absence was conspicuous, given that the Sentinel regularly covered social events and activities involving prominent families, and the Crows had been featured in numerous articles during the years leading up to Delpha's disappearance. It was as if she had simply been erased from the community record, her existence and subsequent absence deemed not worthy of mention or inquiry. The silence suggested either extremely effective suppression of information or a community-wide decision to look the other way from something everyone understood, but nobody was willing to acknowledge publicly. Deputy Tate had been conducting his own research, using online databases to try to locate Martha Crow or any other surviving family members who might be able to provide information about Delpha and the circumstances of her disappearance. He found that Martha had died in 2003 in New Mexico, having spent her final years in an assisted living facility in Las Cruces. There were no children besides Delpha listed in Martha's obituary, suggesting the family line had ended with her death. However, Tate had located several people who had worked for James Crow's construction company during the 1970s and were still living in or near Ochoa County. These individuals represented potential witnesses who might have knowledge about the incident referenced in the handwritten notes found in the caravan, though approaching them would require careful strategy to avoid alerting them to the investigation's direction before Mercer was ready to conduct formal interviews. "Sheriff, I found something interesting in the property records," Tate reported during their evening debriefing. James Crow's construction company was hired for several major county projects during the early 1970s: a new elementary school, renovation of the courthouse, and construction of the county maintenance facility. All of those contracts were awarded without competitive bidding, which wasn't unusual for that era but does suggest close relationships between Crow and county officials who approved the projects. More interesting is that several of those projects were subject to later investigation by state auditors who found significant cost overruns and construction deficiencies that had to be corrected at additional expense. The information painted a picture of potential corruption, or at minimum extremely poor oversight of public construction projects, exactly the kind of situation that might generate whistleblowers or witnesses who became liabilities requiring elimination. Mercer made the decision to request assistance from the Texas Rangers, recognizing that the investigation had expanded beyond a single homicide into a potential examination of decades-old corruption and conspiracy involving multiple individuals who might still be alive and present in the community. She called Ranger Sergeant Tom Jackson, an experienced investigator she had worked with on previous cases, and briefed him on what they had discovered. Jackson agreed to drive down from Midland the following morning to assess the situation and determine what resources the Rangers could provide. In the meantime, Mercer instructed Tate and her other deputies to maintain normal patrol operations while avoiding any discussions of the caravan discovery with community members. She wanted to control the flow of information about the investigation as much as possible, knowing that in a small town like Marfa, news traveled fast, and people who felt threatened by the investigation might take steps to destroy evidence or coordinate their stories before law enforcement could interview them. That night, Mercer found herself unable to sleep, her mind replaying the scene in the caravan and trying to piece together the sequence of events that had led from Delpha Crow's murder in 1975 to her carefully preserved body being discovered in 2019. Someone had maintained knowledge of and access to Delpha's remains for over 40 years, moving them at some point to the caravan on what had once been her father's property, and arranging the evidence that told a story of crime and cover-up. That person had chosen not to simply report what they knew to authorities, but instead to create an elaborate presentation that would force investigation while also protecting their own identity. The psychology behind that choice was complex, suggesting someone who wanted justice for Delpha, but either feared consequences of coming forward directly or wanted the evidence to speak for itself without their personal involvement clouding the investigation. The following morning brought new developments that would accelerate the investigation in unexpected directions. Vernon Hayes called the sheriff's department just after dawn, his voice carrying a tension that immediately put Mercer on alert. "Sheriff, I got something else you need to see out here at the ranch. Was checking some of the outbuildings this morning, going through things more carefully after what we found yesterday, and I discovered something in the old barn that's been locked up for decades. I think you're going to want to see this before I touch anything." Mercer felt a familiar tightness in her chest, knowing that the discovery of the caravan had apparently triggered a more thorough examination of the Hayes property that was now revealing additional evidence. She grabbed Tate and drove back out to the ranch, arriving to find Vernon waiting by a large metal barn that sat several hundred yards from the main house. The barn had clearly been unused for many years, its sliding door rusted partially open and its interior dark despite the morning sun. Vernon led them inside, using a flashlight to illuminate what he had found in a back corner beneath layers of old tarp and forgotten equipment. It was a wooden crate, approximately 3 feet by 2 feet, secured with a padlock similar to the one that had sealed the caravan. Inside the crate, once Tate had cut the lock and they had carefully opened it, were dozens of documents and photographs that appeared to be evidence of James Crow's business activities during the 1970s. Contracts, financial records, photographs of construction sites, and most significantly, documents that appeared to show systematic fraud in billing and materials used for county projects. The crate also contained personal letters written by Delpha Crow to someone named Michael, describing what she had discovered about her father's business practices and her fear about what might happen if she tried to expose the fraud. "My God," Mercer breathed, as she carefully examined the letters, reading Delpha's words written in that same careful cursive script they had seen in the notes found in the caravan. She documented everything, and someone has been keeping this evidence hidden for decades, waiting for the right time to reveal it. The discovery of the crate transformed the investigation, providing concrete evidence of motive for Delpha's murder, and suggesting that whoever had prepared the caravan scene had also been responsible for hiding this box of documents in Vernon's barn. The question of how that person had gained access to the locked barn and why they had chosen to store evidence there rather than in the caravan, required answers that Mercer suspected would only come from identifying the individual who had orchestrated this elaborate revelation of decades-old crimes. Texas Ranger Sergeant Tom Jackson arrived at the Ochoa County Sheriff's Department mid-morning, bringing with him the resources and investigative experience that would prove essential as the case expanded into territory that challenged everything Mercer thought she understood about her community's history. Jackson was a lean man in his late 40s, with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent decades working cases across West Texas, from border towns to isolated ranch country. He had a reputation for methodical investigation and an ability to extract information from reluctant witnesses who thought they could outlast law enforcement patience. As Mercer briefed him on the discoveries at Vernon Hayes's ranch and showed him the evidence they had collected from both the caravan and the barn, she watched his expression shift from professional interest to the kind of focused intensity that indicated he recognized this case as something significant beyond a single cold case homicide. "Sheriff Mercer, what you've got here is a conspiracy that potentially involved multiple individuals over several decades, including possible law enforcement complicity in suppressing the original investigation," Jackson said as he studied the documents spread across Mercer's desk. The letters from Delpha Crow describing her father's fraudulent billing practices, the construction records showing systematic overbilling on county projects, and the complete absence of any official missing person report all point to a coordinated cover-up that required participation from people at various levels of county government. The question we need to answer is who killed Delpha when she threatened to expose the fraud, and who has been protecting that secret for 44 years, while simultaneously preserving evidence that could eventually reveal the truth. Jackson pulled out a legal pad and began making notes, organizing the investigation into distinct threads that would need to be pursued simultaneously to build a comprehensive picture of what had happened and who was responsible. The letters from Delpha to someone named Michael provided the most direct insight into events leading up to her murder. Written between March and June 1975, they documented her growing awareness that her father's construction business was engaged in systematic fraud against Ochoa County, overbilling for materials and labor while using substandard construction methods that created safety hazards in public buildings. Delpha's letters showed her internal struggle between loyalty to her family and moral obligation to report criminal activity. Her fear of her father's reaction if he learned she had discovered his fraud, and her determination to find a way to expose the wrongdoing without destroying her family. The final letter, dated June of 1975, was particularly chilling. "Michael, I've decided I can't stay silent any longer. Tomorrow, I'm going to meet with someone who can help me report what Dad has been doing without it coming directly from me. I know this will change everything, but I can't watch him steal from the county and put children at risk in buildings that aren't safe. If something happens to me, please make sure these letters and documents reach someone who will do the right thing." The next question was identifying Michael and determining whether he was still alive and available to interview. Deputy Tate had already begun searching county records and online databases for men named Michael, who had been living in Ochoa County during the 1970s and might have had a relationship with Delpha Crow. The search had produced several possibilities, but one name stood out based on property records and newspaper archives: Michael Strand, who had worked as an assistant county engineer during the early 1970s before leaving Ochoa County in 1976 under circumstances that were not documented in official records. Strand would have been in his late 20s during the period when Delpha's letters were written, working in a position that would have given him knowledge of county construction projects and the ability to understand the implications of the fraud Delpha was describing. The timing of his departure from Ochoa County, less than a year after Delpha's last letter, raised immediate questions about whether he had been involved in whatever happened to her or had fled the county to escape consequences or threats related to her murder. "Rowan, I need you to locate Michael Strand and find out if he's willing to talk to us," Mercer instructed, recognizing that Strand represented their best chance of understanding what had happened in June 1975 and who had been involved in Delpha's death. "If he's still alive and you can find him, approach carefully. If he's been carrying this secret for 44 years, he might be relieved to finally talk about it, or he might be terrified of consequences from people who are still alive and threatened by this investigation." Tate nodded and moved to his computer to begin the search, while Mercer and Jackson focused on the construction documents found in the barn. The financial records showed a pattern of systematic fraud across multiple county projects during the early 1970s. Invoices for materials that were never delivered, labor charges for workers who were never hired, and change orders that added millions of dollars to project costs without corresponding improvements to the constructed facilities. What made the fraud particularly egregious was evidence that James Crow had deliberately used substandard materials and construction methods while billing the county for premium quality work, creating public buildings that failed to meet safety standards and posed risks to the people who used them. One set of documents related to the elementary school project showed that Crow had billed for steel reinforcement that was never installed, used lower-grade concrete than specified, and failed to properly waterproof the foundation, resulting in structural problems that emerged within a few years of construction. The knowledge that children had been attending classes in a building that was potentially unsafe because of contractor fraud added a layer of moral outrage to the investigation that went beyond simple theft of public funds. Delpha's decision to expose her father's activities, despite the personal cost, began to look not just brave, but necessary to prevent potential tragedy. "Sheriff, look at this," Jackson said, pointing to a memo included among the construction documents. It was written on Ochoa County letterhead and dated July 1975, signed by someone with the initials WB. The memo was brief but revealing. "The Crow situation has been resolved permanently. No further action required. All related documentation to be destroyed per our discussion." The initials WB matched Walter Briggs, the sheriff who had been serving Ochoa County in 1975, suggesting direct law enforcement involvement in the cover-up of whatever had happened to Delpha. The memo's reference to permanent resolution had a sinister implication that became even more disturbing when considered alongside the discovery of Delpha's body and the evidence that she had been murdered to silence her whistleblowing. If Sheriff Briggs had been involved in covering up her murder, it meant the corruption had extended deep into the institutions that were supposed to protect citizens and investigate crimes. The implications were staggering and created complications for the current investigation. If the Ochoa County Sheriff's Department had been compromised in 1975, helping to cover up a murder to protect a contractor who was defrauding the county, then there might be other people still living in the area who had knowledge of or involvement in those crimes. Some of those individuals might still hold positions of influence or authority in the community, creating risks for witnesses who came forward, and challenges for investigators trying to build a case that would implicate prominent citizens in decades-old crimes. Mercer found herself questioning how deep the corruption had gone, and whether any of the current county officials or department members might have family connections to people who had been involved in the original conspiracy. The small-town nature of Ochoa County meant that family relationships and old loyalties could create complex webs of obligation and silence that would be difficult to penetrate. Deputy Tate returned with news that he had located Michael Strand living in Austin, where he had worked as a civil engineer for the State Transportation Department before retiring 5 years earlier. Tate had made initial contact by phone, and Strand had agreed to meet with investigators after learning about the discovery of Delpha's body and the evidence that had been hidden for decades. "Sheriff, he sounded relieved when I told him we had found the documents and letters," Tate reported. He said he's been waiting for this day for 44 years and has information that will explain everything. He's willing to drive to Marfa tomorrow to give a formal statement. Says he has additional materials that he's kept hidden all this time as insurance in case anyone came after him. The news that Strand had preserved his own evidence and was ready to cooperate represented a major breakthrough, though Mercer remained cautious about what he might reveal, and whether his testimony would be sufficient to identify and prosecute anyone who was still alive and legally vulnerable. That afternoon brought another unexpected development when Vernon Hayes called with information he had remembered about the history of his property. "Sheriff, I was talking to my Uncle Frank last night about everything that's been happening, and he reminded me about something from when we first bought this land back in 1982. There was a man who came around a few months after we closed the sale, said he needed to retrieve some personal items that had been stored on the property with the previous owner's permission. My father led him onto the land with an escort, and the man drove out toward the southeast section where you found that caravan. I was just a kid then, but I remember because the man seemed nervous and spent several hours out there before coming back and leaving without explaining what he had been doing." Vernon paused, and Mercer could hear him flipping through what sounded like old papers. "My uncle says the man's name was Michael Strand, and he had official identification showing he worked for the state government." The revelation that Strand had visited the Hayes property shortly after it was sold by the Crow estate and had spent time in the area where the caravan was eventually discovered created new questions about his role in the entire situation. Had Strand been involved in hiding Delpha's body originally, or had he been retrieving evidence that someone else had hidden? His stated intention to retrieve personal items suggested he had known about something being stored on the Crow property, but whether those items were related to Delpha's murder or the construction fraud remained unclear. The fact that he was now willing to come forward and provide information after decades of silence suggested either genuine remorse and desire to see justice done, or strategic self-preservation motivated by the knowledge that evidence had been discovered that might implicate him if he didn't cooperate with investigators. Mercer spent the evening preparing for the interview with Michael Strand, reviewing everything they knew about the case and formulating questions that would test his credibility while also extracting maximum information about events from 1975. Jackson would conduct the formal interview while Mercer observed, a strategic decision based on Jackson's extensive experience with cold case investigations and his ability to detect deception in witnesses who had spent decades constructing narratives about their involvement in past events. They set up the interview room at the sheriff's department with recording equipment that would document every word of Strand's statement, knowing that his testimony might become crucial evidence in prosecutions that could result from the investigation. The weight of what they might learn in the morning hung over Mercer as she tried to sleep that night, her mind racing through scenarios about who had killed Delpha Crow and how many people in Ochoa County had known about the murder and chosen silence over justice. Michael Strand arrived at the sheriff's department at 9 the following morning, driving a late-model sedan with Austin plates and carrying a leather briefcase that presumably contained the materials he had mentioned during his phone conversation with Deputy Tate. He was a tall man in his early 70s, with the careful posture of someone who had maintained physical fitness despite advancing age, dressed in casual clothes that suggested retired professional rather than working rancher or laborer. His face showed the tension of someone approaching a moment they had both dreaded and anticipated for decades, the lines around his eyes and mouth speaking to years of carrying secrets that were about to be revealed. Mercer greeted him in the reception area and led him to the interview room where Jackson was waiting, noting the way Strand's hands trembled slightly as he set his briefcase on the table and took the seat offered to him. "Mr. Strand, thank you for coming in to speak with us," Jackson began after completing the preliminary formalities of recording identity and acknowledging that Strand was participating voluntarily and not under arrest or suspicion. We've discovered evidence that suggests you had a relationship with Delpha Crow in 1975 and may have information relevant to her disappearance and death. Before we discuss specifics, I need to know if you want an attorney present during this interview." Strand shook his head, his voice steady despite obvious emotion when he spoke. "No attorney. I've been waiting 44 years to tell someone what happened, and I'm not going to hide behind legal representation now. Delpha Crow was the best person I've ever known, and she was murdered because she tried to do the right thing. I've kept quiet all these years because I was afraid of the same people who killed her. But I'm 72 years old now, and I'm not afraid anymore. It's time for the truth to come out." The statement set the tone for what would become a 4-hour interview during which Strand provided detailed testimony about events surrounding Delpha's murder, the conspiracy to cover up her death, and his own role in preserving evidence while maintaining silence out of fear for his own safety. His story began with his work as assistant county engineer in 1973, a position that brought him into regular contact with contractors working on county projects, including James Crow's construction company. Strand described becoming aware of irregularities in Crow's billing and construction practices, suspecting fraud but lacking concrete evidence, and facing pressure from his supervisor to approve change orders and payment requests without thorough review. He had begun documenting the problems he observed, keeping copies of suspicious invoices and change orders, but hadn't taken any formal action until Delpha Crow contacted him in early 1975, seeking advice about what she had discovered in her father's business records. Delpha came to my office in March 1975, terrified about what she had found, but determined to do something about it, Strand explained, his voice thick with emotion as he described their first meeting. She had discovered financial records showing systematic fraud across multiple county projects, and she had also found documents suggesting her father was paying kickbacks to county officials who approved his contracts without proper oversight. She was afraid to go directly to law enforcement because she suspected Sheriff Briggs was one of the officials receiving payments from her father. She asked me to help her figure out how to report the fraud to state authorities without it being traced back to her, because she knew her father would be dangerous if he found out she was the source of the information. Strand described helping Delpha organize her evidence and prepare documentation that could be submitted anonymously to the State Attorney General's office, their relationship developing from professional cooperation into something deeper as they spent time together working on the case. The letters Delpha had written to Michael documented their growing closeness and her increasing fear as she realized the scope of her father's criminal activities and the number of people who were complicit in protecting him. Strand confirmed that he had received all the letters found in the caravan and had preserved them along with copies of the construction documents as evidence of what Delpha had been trying to expose. In June 1975, Delpha decided she couldn't wait any longer to report the fraud. There had been an incident at the elementary school where part of a ceiling had collapsed because of substandard construction, and while no children were injured, she was terrified that someone would eventually be killed because of her father's corner cutting. She told me she was going to meet with a reporter from the El Paso newspaper who had covered corruption stories and would know how to protect her identity while investigating her allegations. Strand's voice broke as he described what happened next. That meeting never happened. On June 19th, Delpha disappeared. According to Strand's account, he had become alarmed when Delpha failed to show up for a planned meeting on the evening of June 19th and didn't respond to messages left at her family home. He had gone to the Crow residence the following day and been told by Martha Crow that Delpha had gone to stay with relatives in El Paso and would be away for an extended period. Strand had known this was false because Delpha had no relatives in El Paso and had been planning to meet with the reporter there, not visit family. I tried to file a missing person report with the sheriff's department, but Sheriff Briggs refused to take it, said that Delpha was an adult who had every right to travel without notifying anyone, and that her mother had confirmed she was safe. I pushed back, said I had reason to believe she might be in danger, and that's when Briggs made it very clear that I should drop the matter and mind my own business. He said people who asked too many questions about the Crow family tended to find themselves facing serious problems, and he suggested I think carefully about my future employment prospects in Ochoa County. The threat had been effective. Strand described returning to his apartment and finding it had been broken into, his files ransacked, and all documentation related to county construction projects stolen. He had received anonymous phone calls warning him to leave Ochoa County and forget everything he knew about Delpha Crow and James Crow's business activities. Threats that became more explicit and dangerous until Strand finally resigned his position and moved to Austin in September 1976. But I didn't forget, and I didn't destroy all the evidence, Strand said, opening his briefcase to remove a thick folder of documents. I kept copies of everything Delpha had given me and everything I had documented about the fraud. I also kept her letters, which she had asked me to preserve in case something happened to her. Over the years I debated coming forward, but I was afraid that the people who had killed her would come after me if I tried to expose what had happened. Then, a few months ago, I learned that James Crow had died, and I started thinking that maybe it was finally safe to reveal the truth. Jackson leaned forward, his expression intense, as he asked the critical question. "Mr. Strand, do you have direct knowledge of who killed Delpha Crow?" Strand nodded slowly, his face showing the weight of the secret he had carried for over 4 decades. "I don't know who physically killed her, but I know who ordered it. About a week after Delpha disappeared, I received a phone call from someone who claimed to have information about what happened to her. The caller was anonymous, but they told me that James Crow had discovered Delpha was planning to expose his fraud and had arranged for her to be killed. The caller said that Sheriff Briggs had helped dispose of the body and had ensured no investigation would take place. They also said that several other county officials were involved in the cover-up and would do whatever was necessary to protect themselves. The caller warned me that I would be next if I didn't leave town and keep quiet. The testimony provided by Strand was devastating in its implications, suggesting a conspiracy that had involved not just James Crow, but also the sheriff and possibly other county officials who had worked together to murder a young woman and suppress any investigation into her death. Jackson pressed for more details about the anonymous caller and whether Strand had any evidence beyond the phone call to support the allegations about who had been involved in Delpha's murder. Strand admitted that he had no direct proof beyond what the caller had told him and the circumstantial evidence of Sheriff Briggs' behavior and the coordinated threats he had received. "But I can tell you this," Strand added, pulling another document from his briefcase. "About 6 months after I moved to Austin, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photograph showing Delpha's body wrapped in plastic and duct tape, along with a note saying, 'This is what happens to people who can't mind their own business.' The photograph haunted me for years, and I kept it as evidence even though looking at it made me sick." Mercer felt her stomach turn as Strand produced the photograph, which matched exactly what they had found in the caravan on Vernon Hayes' property. The image confirmed that Strand's story was consistent with physical evidence, and suggested that whoever had sent him the photograph had been directly involved in Delpha's murder and wanted to ensure his continued silence. The question of who had sent the package and why they had later decided to preserve evidence that could expose the crime remained unanswered, creating a puzzle that would require additional investigation to solve. Jackson documented the photograph and took custody of all the materials Strand had brought, including the construction fraud evidence and Delpha's original letters. The interview continued for another hour, as Jackson systematically worked through details about people who had worked for Ochoa County in 1975, relationships between various officials and the Crow family, and any other information Strand could provide about the conspiracy that had resulted in Delpha's death. When the interview concluded, Strand remained seated for a moment, looking emotionally drained but also somehow lighter, as if the burden he had carried for decades had been partially lifted by finally telling the truth. "Sheriff Mercer, can I ask what made you start investigating this case now?" he said as he prepared to leave. "What led you to find Delpha's body after all these years?" Mercer explained about Vernon Hayes discovering the caravan on his property and the evidence that had been carefully preserved inside, watching Strand's reaction as he processed the information. His expression showed recognition and something that might have been satisfaction, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place in his mind. "I think I know who preserved that evidence," Strand said slowly. "There was someone else who knew what had happened to Delpha, someone who was involved in the original conspiracy but later developed a conscience about what they had done. I received occasional anonymous messages over the years, always around the anniversary of Delpha's death, suggesting that the truth would eventually come out and justice would be served. I think someone decided that with James Crow dead and enough time passed, it was finally safe to reveal what happened. The suggestion that someone with direct involvement in Delpha's murder or its cover-up had later worked to preserve evidence and arrange for its discovery added yet another layer to an already complex investigation." Mercer and Jackson discussed the possibility after Strand left, trying to identify who might fit that profile and what their motivations might have been. The most logical candidate was someone who had been relatively young in 1975 and had been pressured or coerced into participating in the conspiracy. Someone who had lived with guilt for decades and finally decided to seek redemption by ensuring the truth came to light. The careful preservation of evidence and the symbolic choice to place Delpha's body on land that had belonged to her father suggested someone who had known the family well and understood the significance of various locations and materials that had been arranged in the caravan. The identification of the person who had preserved and arranged Delpha Crow's evidence came from an unexpected source 3 days after Michael Strand's interview. Deputy Tate had been systematically working through employment records from Ochoa County during the 1970s, creating lists of people who had worked in positions that would have given them knowledge of or access to information about county construction projects and James Crow's activities. Among those names was Thomas Garrett, who had worked as a deputy under Sheriff Walter Briggs from 1973 to 1978 before leaving law enforcement and eventually becoming a rancher in the northern part of the county. Garrett was now 71 years old, still living on his ranch property, and according to public records had never married or had children. The profile suggested someone who might have withdrawn from normal social engagement, possibly carrying guilt or trauma from past experiences that had shaped his solitary lifestyle. Mercer decided to approach Garrett directly, rather than attempting surveillance or indirect investigation, gambling that if he was indeed the person who had preserved evidence about Delpha's murder, he might be ready to complete the process he had started by arranging for the caravan to be discovered. She drove to his ranch alone on a morning when autumn was beginning to assert itself across West Texas, the brutal summer heat finally giving way to temperatures that made outdoor work bearable and reminded people why anyone had ever chosen to settle in this harsh landscape. Garrett's property was modest compared to Vernon Hayes' operation, perhaps 800 acres of rough country that supported a small cattle herd and provided enough income to sustain a simple lifestyle. The ranch house was a single-story structure that had been well maintained, but showed no signs of decoration or personal touches, the home of someone who valued function over comfort and solitude over company. Garrett was working in a corral when Mercer arrived, mending a section of fence that had been damaged by cattle pushing against weak posts. He looked up at the sound of her vehicle, his weathered face showing no surprise at her arrival, as if he had been expecting this visit and was almost relieved that it had finally come. "Sheriff Mercer," he said without preamble as she approached. his voice carrying the rough texture of someone who spent more time talking to animals than people. "I figured you'd get around to me eventually, once you started tracing who knew what back in the 70s. Guess I should have just come to you after Vernon found that caravan, but old habits of staying quiet die hard even when you want them to end." The admission confirmed Mercer's suspicions before she had even asked a question, and she felt a complex mixture of satisfaction at the breakthrough and sadness at the cost this man had clearly paid for his role in events from 4 decades ago. They sat on Garrett's porch in weathered chairs that looked out over the empty landscape, the kind of vista that encouraged honesty, because it reminded people how small and temporary they were against the permanence of geology and sky. Garrett didn't wait for Mercer to begin her questions, instead launching into a confession that had apparently been building for years and now spilled out with the relief of someone finally unburdening themselves of weight they had carried too long. "I was 26 years old in 1975, new to the sheriff's department, and eager to prove myself to Sheriff Briggs and the other senior deputies. When Briggs told me that James Crow's daughter was causing problems by threatening to report fraud that would damage the county and cost good people their jobs, I believed him. I believed we were protecting the community by keeping Delpha quiet. I didn't know they meant to kill her until it was already done." According to Garrett's account, Sheriff Briggs had recruited him to help with what was described as convincing Delpha Crow to drop her investigation into her father's business practices, suggesting it would be a simple conversation that would resolve the situation without anyone getting hurt. Briggs and James Crow took me to a location out in the desert, one of Crow's old construction trailers that he used as a field office during remote projects. When we got there, Delpha was already inside, tied to a chair. Briggs told me she had been uncooperative and needed to understand the seriousness of interfering with county business. I was told to stand guard outside while they talked to her. Garrett's voice cracked with emotion that had clearly never diminished despite 4 decades of distance from the events. I heard her screaming, heard the sounds of violence, and I just stood there doing nothing because I was afraid and confused and didn't understand what was really happening until it was over. When Briggs and James Crow finally emerged from the trailer, they had informed Garrett that Delpha was dead and that he was now complicit in her murder, whether he had intended to be or not. They had given him a choice: help dispose of the body and keep silent about what had happened, or be framed as the person who had killed her, while the real perpetrators used their positions and influence to ensure he was convicted and executed. "I made the wrong choice," Garrett said, his hands trembling as he stared out at the horizon. "I helped them wrap her body and hide it in a storage building on the Crow property, and then I spent the next 44 years living with what I had done. Every day, I thought about Delpha, about how she had been trying to do the right thing and I had been part of silencing her forever. I tried to make amends in small ways, sending information to Michael Strand to let him know he wasn't alone in knowing the truth, keeping copies of evidence that Briggs had ordered me to destroy, waiting for the day when enough time had passed and enough people had died that I could finally reveal what happened. The decision to preserve Delpha's body and the evidence about her father's fraud had been Garrett's attempt at redemption, a way to ensure that even if he never found the courage to come forward directly, the truth would eventually be known. I moved her body to the caravan about 5 years ago after James Crow died, and I felt like the most dangerous person involved was gone. I drove onto Vernon's property at night, knowing the land well enough from when it belonged to the Crows, and I arranged everything the way I hoped would tell the story of what had happened and why. I kept hoping someone would find it before I died, because I couldn't stand the thought of Delpha staying hidden forever, of no one ever knowing what she had tried to do and what it cost her. Garrett looked directly at Mercer for the first time since beginning his confession. "I'm ready to face whatever consequences come from what I did. I know I was a coward then, and I've been a coward for 44 years. But maybe there's still time to do the right thing, even if it's decades too late." Mercer listened to the entire confession in silence, recording every word while trying to process the moral complexity of a man who had been complicit in murder but had also worked in his own limited way to ensure justice was eventually possible. The law was clear about Garrett's criminal liability for his participation in Delpha's death and the subsequent cover-up. But Mercer also recognized that his cooperation now was essential to building a complete picture of the conspiracy and identifying whether anyone else who had been involved was still alive and could be prosecuted. "Thomas, I need to know everything about who else was involved beyond you, Sheriff Briggs, and James Crow. Were there other county officials who knew what happened? Were there other law enforcement officers who participated in the cover-up?" Garrett nodded slowly, seeming to gather his thoughts before providing information that would shake Ochoa County's establishment to its foundations. There were 3 county commissioners who were receiving regular payments from James Crow in exchange for approving his contracts without proper oversight or competitive bidding. They knew about the fraud, and they knew about Delpha's murder, though they didn't participate directly in killing her. They helped ensure that no investigation would take place and that anyone asking questions would face pressure to stop. 2 of those commissioners are dead now, died years ago without ever facing consequences. But one is still alive. Garrett paused, clearly troubled by what he was about to reveal. Robert Vance. He was the youngest commissioner back then, only in his early 30s, and now he's the mayor of Marfa. He spent the last 40 years building a reputation as a civic leader and defender of West Texas heritage, all while knowing he helped cover up a murder and protect systematic theft from the county. He's the one who sent me to monitor Vernon's property periodically to make sure the caravan hadn't been accidentally discovered before I was ready for it to be found. The revelation that Marfa's current mayor had been involved in the 1975 conspiracy created immediate complications for the investigation and for Ochoa County's political landscape. Robert Vance was a prominent figure in the community, serving his 3rd term as mayor and wielding considerable influence over local business and development decisions. His family had deep roots in West Texas, and he was generally regarded as a pillar of the community whose involvement in various charitable and civic organizations had made him popular with voters and influential with state officials. The knowledge that this respected leader had been complicit in murder and fraud for over 4 decades would devastate the community's trust in its institutions and raise serious questions about what other secrets might be hidden behind Ochoa County's carefully maintained image of small-town integrity and traditional values. Mercer knew she needed to move quickly before word of Garrett's confession reached Vance and gave him opportunity to destroy evidence or flee the jurisdiction. She called Ranger Jackson and briefed him on what she had learned, coordinating an immediate plan to secure search warrants for Vance's home and office, while also preparing to take him into custody for questioning. The legal strategy would be complex, given that the original crimes had occurred 44 years ago and most of the principal perpetrators were dead, but Garrett's testimony combined with the physical evidence and documents they had recovered should be sufficient to charge Vance with conspiracy and obstruction of justice, if not with direct involvement in Delpha's murder. The fact that Vance had continued his involvement in the cover-up by monitoring the caravan's concealment suggested ongoing criminal conduct that fell within the statute of limitations and could be prosecuted even if the original murder charges were complicated by time. That evening, as Mercer and Jackson prepared to execute search warrants and arrest Robert Vance, a final piece of the puzzle fell into place that explained the timing of why the evidence had been revealed now rather than years earlier. Deputy Tate discovered that Vance had been diagnosed with terminal cancer 6 months ago and had been given approximately 1 year to live. The diagnosis appeared to have triggered some change in Garrett's calculations about when it was safe to allow the caravan to be discovered, knowing that Vance would not live long enough to pose a physical threat to anyone who came forward with the information about the conspiracy. The timing suggested careful planning and patience on Garrett's part, waiting for natural causes to remove the last dangerous player before revealing secrets that had been buried for decades. It was a cold calculation, but one that reflected the genuine fear that had kept multiple people silent for so long about crimes committed by men who wielded power and demonstrated willingness to kill to protect their interests. The arrest of Robert Vance occurred at his home in Marfa, conducted quietly to avoid media attention that would turn the event into a spectacle before the investigation was complete and charges had been formally filed. Vance initially denied any knowledge of Delpha Crow's murder or the conspiracy that had surrounded it, maintaining the posture of outraged innocence that had apparently served him well for 4 decades. But when confronted with Garrett's detailed confession and the physical evidence that corroborated the account of systematic fraud and cover-up, his resistance began to crumble. The search of his home office had uncovered materials that he had kept despite the risk they posed, including financial records showing payments from James Crow that corresponded to the periods when county contracts were being approved without proper review. Vance had apparently been unable to completely destroy evidence of his participation in the conspiracy, either out of some vestige of conscience or because he recognized that the evidence might serve as leverage or insurance if other members of the conspiracy ever threatened him. In the interview room at the sheriff's department, facing the reality that his carefully constructed life was about to collapse around him and that he would likely die in prison rather than in the comfortable respectability he had cultivated, Vance made the calculation that cooperation might earn him some small measure of reduced charges or more lenient conditions during his remaining months of life. I was young and ambitious in 1975, serving my first term as county commissioner and eager to be seen as someone who could facilitate business development and economic growth for Ochoa County. James Crow approached me and other officials with what he presented as a mutually beneficial arrangement. He would provide financial support for our campaigns and civic initiatives, and we would ensure his construction company received favorable treatment in contract awards and oversight. I knew it was wrong, but I justified it by telling myself that the county benefited from having an experienced contractor doing the work and that the financial arrangements were just how business got done in West Texas. According to Vance's account, he had not been directly involved in the decision to kill Delpha Crow or in the actual murder, but he had been informed afterward that she had been eliminated as a threat to their arrangement. Sheriff Briggs told me that Delpha had been taken care of and that no investigation would be conducted as long as everyone maintained silence about the situation. He made it clear that anyone who broke ranks would face the same fate, and given that we had all just witnessed how far they were willing to go to protect the fraud scheme, no one was willing to test whether he was serious about that threat. Vance described living for 44 years with the knowledge of what had happened, watching Marfa and Ochoa County slowly decline as the oil money dried up and younger generations moved away seeking opportunities elsewhere, all while maintaining his public image as a community leader who cared about preserving West Texas heritage and values. The interviews with Garrett and Vance, combined with the physical evidence and documentary materials that had been recovered from the caravan and Vernon Hayes's barn, provided enough information for Texas Rangers and prosecutors to build comprehensive cases about the 1975 conspiracy and its decades-long cover-up. Thomas Garrett was charged with being an accessory to murder and obstruction of justice, though his cooperation would likely result in a plea agreement that took into account his age, his role in ultimately revealing the truth, and the complicated moral circumstances of his involvement. Robert Vance faced more serious charges including conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and ongoing criminal conduct related to his efforts to monitor and conceal evidence over multiple decades. His terminal cancer diagnosis created unusual circumstances for prosecution, as he would likely die before any trial could be completed. But the process of formally charging and arraigning him served important symbolic purposes in acknowledging the crimes and providing some measure of justice for Delpha Crow. The most difficult aspect of the case's resolution was dealing with the reality that many of the primary perpetrators would never face earthly justice for what they had done. Sheriff Walter Briggs had died in 2003, James Crow in 2018, and the other county commissioners who had been involved in the conspiracy had passed away years earlier without ever being held accountable for their crimes. The legal principle that death ends criminal liability meant that no charges could be filed against them, no trials would examine their actions, and no official record would document their guilt beyond the evidence gathered during the current investigation. For Michael Strand and other people who had been affected by the conspiracy's crimes and cover-up, this outcome was deeply unsatisfying, highlighting how time and natural death could provide escape from consequences that should have been faced decades earlier when the crimes were fresh and the perpetrators still active in positions of authority. Dr. Martinez completed his forensic analysis of Delpha Crow's remains, confirming through DNA testing that the body was indeed hers, and providing detailed documentation of the injuries that had killed her. His report described extensive blunt force trauma to her head and face, indicating she had been beaten severely before her death in a sustained attack that reflected rage or determination to ensure she could not survive to reveal what she knew. The brutality of her murder stood in stark contrast to the careful preservation of her body afterward, suggesting that while the killing had been savage and desperate, the subsequent handling reflected someone's need to maintain some form of dignity or control over the situation. Martinez's conclusion was that Delpha had suffered tremendously before dying, a finding that made her final letters to Michael Strand even more poignant in their expression of courage and determination to expose wrongdoing, despite the personal risks she must have recognized she was taking. The public revelation of the case created shockwaves throughout Ochoa County and West Texas, generating media coverage that focused on the decades-long conspiracy, the failure of institutions that should have protected citizens and investigated crimes, and the disturbing ease with which powerful men had been able to murder someone who threatened their financial interests. The story resonated beyond West Texas because it touched on themes that were relevant across rural America. The vulnerability of individuals who challenge corrupt power structures, the ways that small communities can become complicit in silence about crimes everyone knows occurred, but no one will formally acknowledge, and the difficulty of achieving justice when perpetrators have time and resources to cover their tracks and intimidate potential witnesses. For Marfa specifically, the case forced an uncomfortable reckoning with the town's history, and the reality that the prosperity of the 1970s had been built partly on systematic fraud that had ultimately damaged the community when the truth remained hidden and the corruption festered. Vernon Hayes took the discovery and investigation with the stoic acceptance that characterized many West Texas ranchers who had learned that life rarely unfolded according to plans or preferences. The fact that his property had been used to conceal evidence of a decades-old murder was disturbing, but he recognized that he had played an essential role in finally bringing the truth to light by reporting what he had found rather than ignoring it or handling it privately. "Sheriff, I guess my grandfather was right about this land having bad memories," Vernon said during one of Mercer's final visits to brief him on the case's resolution. "But maybe now that the truth is out and Delpha can be properly laid to rest, those memories can finally be put behind us, and this section of the ranch can just be land again instead of a tomb." Mercer appreciated the sentiment, even as she recognized that land retained memories in ways that transcended human preference, and the area where the caravan had sat would likely always carry associations with what had been discovered there. For Mercer personally, the case represented both a successful investigation and a troubling window into the history of the institution she served. The reality that a previous sheriff had been directly involved in murder and cover-up, using his authority to prevent investigation and intimidate witnesses, cast a shadow over the Ochoa County Sheriff's Department that would take years to fully dispel. She made a commitment to review other cold cases from the Briggs era, looking for patterns that might indicate other crimes had been covered up or investigations had been deliberately sabotaged to protect powerful interests. The work would be difficult and might uncover truths that some community members would prefer to remain buried, but Mercer believed that the integrity of law enforcement in Ochoa County required honest accounting of past failures, even when that accounting was painful and embarrassing. Michael Strand attended Delpha Crow's memorial service, held in Marfa 6 months after her remains were discovered, and after all the investigations and legal proceedings had advanced to points where her body could be released for burial. The service was small, attended by people who remembered her from before her death and others who had been affected by learning her story and wanted to pay respects to someone whose courage had ultimately been vindicated, even though it came decades too late to save her life. Strand spoke briefly during the service, describing Delpha as someone who had believed in doing what was right regardless of personal cost, someone who had seen corruption and injustice and refused to look away even when looking away would have been safer and easier. She deserved better than what this county gave her in 1975, Strand said, his voice steady despite visible emotion. She deserved protection and justice and the right to live her life. Instead, she got betrayal and violence and 44 years of being hidden away as if she had never existed. But she did exist. And now everyone knows what she tried to do and what it cost her. That's not enough, but it's something. Thomas Garrett did not attend the memorial service, having decided that his presence would be inappropriate given his role in Delpha's death and burial. He instead wrote a letter that was read by Ranger Jackson during the service, in which Garrett apologized to Delpha's memory and to everyone who had been affected by the crimes of 1975 and their cover-up. "I cannot undo what I did or failed to do," the letter stated. "I cannot bring back the years that Delpha should have lived or restore the trust that was broken when people who should have protected her instead chose to silence her forever. But I can finally tell the truth about what happened and accept responsibility for my part in allowing evil to triumph because I was too afraid and too weak to stand against it. I hope that somewhere, somehow, Delpha knows that the truth has finally been told and that her courage has been acknowledged, even though acknowledgement comes far too late to matter in the ways it should have mattered." The investigation's conclusion left Mercer with a complex set of feelings about justice, mortality, and the weight of secrets carried across decades. Most of the people who had been directly responsible for Delpha Crow's murder and the subsequent cover-up had died without facing legal consequences, protected by time and the limitations of a justice system that struggled to address crimes that spanned generations and involved institutions that had since changed dramatically. But the truth had been revealed. The conspiracy had been exposed, and the surviving members who had participated in covering up Delpha's death would face at least some accountability before they died. It was imperfect justice, incomplete and frustratingly limited by circumstances beyond anyone's control, but it was more than had seemed possible when Vernon Hayes first called about a strange caravan on his property. 3 months after Delpha's memorial service, Robert Vance died in the county hospital with his terminal cancer having progressed to the point where further treatment was futile. He had pleaded guilty to charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice, providing a formal admission of his role in the 1975 crimes and the decades of cover-up that had followed. His death removed the possibility of a trial that might have provided more complete public accounting of the conspiracy, but his guilty plea ensured that an official record existed, documenting his participation in crimes that had damaged Ochoa County in ways that extended far beyond the immediate harm to Delpha Crow and her family. Thomas Garrett's case proceeded through the legal system more slowly, with prosecutors ultimately accepting a plea agreement that acknowledged his cooperation and his role in ultimately revealing the truth, while also holding him accountable for his participation in concealing a murder for 44 years. Mercer continued serving as sheriff of Ochoa County, her reputation enhanced by the successful investigation, but her perspective on law enforcement fundamentally altered by what she had learned about how institutions could be corrupted, and how easily truth could be suppressed when powerful people decided their interests outweighed justice. She implemented new protocols for case documentation and evidence preservation, ensuring that future investigations would be harder to conceal or manipulate. And she worked with community leaders to rebuild trust in county government after the revelations about corruption that had extended from the 1970s into the present day. The work was difficult and progress was slow, but Mercer believed it was essential if Ochoa County was going to move beyond its troubled history and create a future where citizens could trust that their institutions served justice rather than protecting the powerful. On quiet evenings when she drove home from the sheriff's department, Mercer often found herself thinking about Delpha Crow and the courage it must have taken to stand against her own father and the network of officials who had been profiting from his fraud. Delpha had been only 23 years old when she died, younger than some of Mercer's deputies, with her entire life ahead of her and every reason to look the other way from crimes that didn't directly affect her. But she had chosen to act on what she believed was right, and that choice had cost her everything. The tragedy was that it had taken 44 years for anyone else to show similar courage, for anyone to decide that revealing the truth was worth the risks and complications that would follow. Mercer wondered how many other secrets were buried in West Texas soil, how many other stories of injustice and corruption lay waiting to be discovered by people who stumbled across evidence in abandoned caravans or locked barns or anywhere else that victims or guilty parties had hidden truth waiting for the right moment to emerge. The caravan itself was eventually destroyed after serving as evidence in the legal proceedings, cut apart and recycled rather than being allowed to become a macabre tourist attraction or memorial to violence. Vernon Hayes's ranch returned to its normal operations, the southeast section where the caravan had sat becoming just another part of the landscape, rather than a crime scene marked by yellow tape and official vehicles. But the land remembered, as land always does in West Texas, where geology operates on timescales that make human dramas seem like brief disturbances in patterns that stretch back millions of years. The desert kept its secrets until it didn't, until weather or chance or human choice revealed what had been hidden, and then the desert accepted whatever came next with the indifference of something that would outlast all the people who briefly occupied its spaces. Sheriff Cass Mercer learned to live with the knowledge that justice was often incomplete, that truth revealed decades late provided cold comfort to people who had been wronged when the crimes were fresh, and that institutions meant to protect citizens could become instruments of oppression when the wrong people held power, and good people chose silence over courage. But she also learned that persistence mattered, that patient investigation could eventually penetrate even the most carefully constructed cover-ups, and that even after decades of darkness, there were people like Thomas Garrett who eventually chose redemption over continued complicity, even when redemption came at terrible personal cost. The case of Delpha Crow would remain in Mercer's mind for the rest of her career, a reminder of why the work of law enforcement mattered, and why silence in the face of injustice was never neutral, but always a choice with consequences that rippled across generations. Years later, long after the headlines had faded and Ochoa County had moved on to other concerns, Mercer would sometimes drive out past Vernon Hayes Ranch toward the area where the caravan had been discovered. She would stand in that shallow depression looking out at the endless West Texas landscape, thinking about a young woman who had tried to do the right thing and had been murdered for that choice, and about all the people who had known what happened and chosen to remain silent until silence became impossible. The desert wind moved through creosote bushes the same way it had for thousands of years, indifferent to human drama but somehow carrying whispers of all the stories that had unfolded across this hard country. And somewhere in that wind, Mercer liked to imagine, was acknowledgement that Delpha Crow's courage had mattered, that truth had eventually triumphed over concealment, and that justice, however delayed and incomplete, had finally been served in the empty spaces where secrets had been buried beneath layers of sand and silence. Sheriff Hoyt Laramie had always understood that East Texas forests could swallow a man whole without leaving a trace, the dense canopy of pine and hardwood creating a twilight world where landmarks disappeared within yards and sounds echoed strangely through undergrowth thick enough to hide anything from casual observation. After 19 years serving Sabine County, a territory of deep woods and winding creeks where logging roads penetrated areas that hadn't seen human habitation since the Depression era, he thought he understood the particular dangers that came with operating in country, where cell phone coverage was non-existent, and the nearest help might be hours away even if someone knew exactly where to look. The searches he had coordinated over the years were etched into his memory with the clarity that came from cases where minutes mattered, and geography worked against every attempt to find people before exposure or injury claimed them permanently. Lost hikers who wandered off marked trails and couldn't find their way back to roads that all looked identical in forests that stretched for miles in every direction. Hunters who suffered accidents while working alone in remote stands and lay injured where no one would think to search. The occasional domestic situation that turned violent and ended with someone fleeing into woods that provided temporary sanctuary but eventually became a trap for people unprepared for the challenge of surviving without supplies or knowledge of the terrain. But nothing in Laramie's experience had prepared him for what began on a cold November morning in 2000. When a call about a missing deer hunter would lead him into darkness that had been festering in Sabine County's forests for decades, hidden among the pines where old sins had taken root and grown into something that defied easy categories of crime or investigation. The call came in at 7:15 in the morning from Rachel Monroe, whose husband Carl had failed to return from a solo hunting trip that should have concluded the previous evening. Rachel's voice carried the controlled anxiety of someone trying to remain calm while fighting against worst-case scenarios that crowded into consciousness when loved ones disappeared into wilderness areas where a dozen different accidents could turn fatal before anyone knew something was wrong. Carl had left their home near Hemp Hill 3 days earlier, planning to hunt a section of private land he leased from a timber company that owned vast tracts of forest throughout Sabine County. He had supplies for a week and experience that should have kept him safe in conditions that were challenging but not unusually dangerous for someone familiar with the woods and comfortable spending extended periods working alone in remote locations. Sheriff Laramie, Carl always checks in by radio every evening at 6 o'clock, just so I know he's okay, Rachel explained, her voice tight with stress that came from a full night spent waiting for contact that never came. When he didn't call last night, I figured maybe his radio batteries died or he had equipment problems. But this morning I drove out to the access point where he parked his truck, and the vehicle is still there, but there's no sign of Carl anywhere near it. His gear looks undisturbed, like he just walked into the woods and never came back. Laramie asked the standard questions while already knowing the answers would be insufficient until he saw the situation firsthand. Had Carl mentioned specific locations where he planned to hunt? Had he experienced any health problems recently that might affect his ability to navigate or handle unexpected situations? Was there any possibility he had encountered other people in the woods who might have information about his whereabouts or what might have happened to him? Rachel's responses painted the picture of an experienced outdoorsman who had been hunting these same woods for 15 years and knew them well enough to avoid the common mistakes that claimed less experienced hunters every season. The drive to Carl Munro's access point took 40 minutes through country that transitioned from the scattered development around Hemp Hill into unbroken forest that pressed close to narrow roads winding between trees that blocked direct sunlight even at midday. This was timber company land that had been logged selectively over decades, leaving a patchwork of old growth and managed forests that created the kind of complex terrain where hunting was productive. But navigation could be challenging for people who didn't maintain careful awareness of their position relative to known landmarks. Laramie brought Deputy Ewell Drayton with him, a former Army Ranger who had joined the department 5 years earlier, after completing his service and returning to his hometown, seeking the kind of work that used his skills while allowing him to stay connected to the outdoor lifestyle he valued. Drayton had extensive training in wilderness tracking and search operations, making him the obvious choice for situations that required working in remote forest areas where standard law enforcement procedures needed to be adapted to environmental challenges. Carl Munro's truck was parked exactly where Rachel had described, pulled onto a widened section of logging road that provided space for vehicles without blocking timber company access to the surrounding forest. The truck bed contained typical hunting supplies: coolers for storing game meat, ropes and pulleys for field dressing deer, and basic camping equipment that Carl apparently preferred to leave at his vehicle rather than carrying into his hunting areas. More concerning was what they found inside the truck cab. Carl's cell phone sitting on the dashboard where he had left it, knowing that coverage in these woods was non-existent and carrying the device would serve no purpose, and his wallet containing identification and emergency contact information that any experienced outdoorsman would normally carry on their person in case something happened and they needed to be identified by rescuers or medical personnel. The presence of these items suggested Carl had left them deliberately rather than forgetting them, but the reasoning behind that decision wasn't immediately clear. "Sheriff, look at this," Drayton called from where he was examining the area around the truck. "There's a clear trail heading into the woods, boot prints in the soft ground showing Carl walked in this direction, but there's something odd about the pattern." Laramie joined him to study the tracks, noting immediately what had caught Drayton's attention. The footprints showed Carl had walked into the forest with normal stride and spacing, but approximately 50 yards from the truck, the pattern changed. The prints became closer together and showed signs of hesitation, with several places where Carl had apparently stopped and shifted his weight as if observing something or considering his next move. More troubling were additional prints that appeared alongside Carl's tracks, boot impressions that were slightly larger and showed a different tread pattern than the hunting boots Carl had been wearing. Someone else had been in this area recently, and based on the way the tracks overlapped, that person had either been following Carl or had walked the same path shortly after him. "Ewell, can you tell how fresh these other tracks are?" Laramie asked, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that came with searches that started revealing unexpected complications. Drayton knelt to examine the prints more closely, using techniques Laramie had seen him employ on previous searches where reading sign was crucial to understanding what had happened in remote locations. No more than 3 or 4 days old based on how the edges have weathered and leaf debris has settled into the impressions. Whoever made these tracks was out here during the same time period Carl was hunting. Could be another hunter working nearby, or could be someone who had reason to follow Carl specifically. The possibility that Carl Munro's disappearance involved another person rather than simple accident or misadventure changed the nature of the search and required different approaches to investigating what might have happened. They followed the tracks deeper into the forest, moving slowly to avoid disturbing evidence while also maintaining awareness of their surroundings in country where visibility dropped to yards once you left the logging roads and entered the dense undergrowth that characterized these East Texas woods. The trail led generally northeast, following a route that took advantage of natural openings in the vegetation and avoided the thickest tangles of brush that would have slowed progress and made noise that might spook game animals. Carl had clearly been moving with purpose toward a specific destination rather than wandering randomly through the forest, suggesting he knew where he was going and had probably hunted this area before during previous trips. The presence of the second set of tracks maintaining parallel course added an element of surveillance or pursuit that made Laramie increasingly uneasy about what they might find when they located Carl or discovered why he had failed to return to his truck. After approximately half a mile, the tracks led to a small clearing where the forest canopy opened enough to allow sunlight to reach the ground and create the kind of edge habitat that attracted deer and other game animals. The clearing showed clear signs of having been used as a hunting location. A portable tree stand had been secured to a large pine on the clearing's edge, providing elevated position for observing game movements without being easily detected by animals approaching through the surrounding forest. Empty water bottles and energy bar wrappers near the base of the tree indicated Carl had spent considerable time in this location, probably waiting for deer to appear during the dawn and dusk periods when they were most active. But Carl himself was not present, and the tree stand sat empty despite being positioned for optimal hunting success. More disturbing was what they found when Drayton climbed up to examine the stand itself. Carl's rifle was still secured in the weapon rest, unfired and with a full magazine, suggesting he had not been spooked by game or forced to abandon the position because of immediate danger. "Sheriff, this doesn't make sense," Drayton called down from the stand. "Why would Carl leave his rifle behind? That's not something any hunter would do voluntarily, especially not in remote country where the weapon serves as both tool and protection." Laramie agreed, feeling pieces of a disturbing pattern beginning to emerge from evidence that suggested Carl Monroe had not simply gotten lost or suffered an accident that prevented his return. The abandoned rifle, the wallet and phone left at the truck, the presence of another person's tracks following his trail, all of it pointed toward something more complex and troubling than a straightforward search and rescue operation. They needed to expand their search of the area and look for additional signs of what had happened after Carl left the tree stand, whether by choice or under circumstances that forced him to abandon his position and his primary hunting weapon. Deputy Drayton discovered the next piece of evidence approximately 100 yards beyond the clearing, partially concealed beneath a layer of fallen leaves that had accumulated in a shallow depression. It was Carl's hunting vest, the fluorescent orange garment that Texas law required hunters to wear for visibility and safety. The vest had been deliberately buried under the leaves rather than simply dropped or lost, suggesting someone had tried to conceal it and hide evidence of Carl's presence in this area. More concerning were the dark stains on the vest's fabric, discoloration that looked like blood even after exposure to weather and moisture from the forest floor. Laramie photographed the vest in place before carefully recovering it for later laboratory analysis, knowing that if the stains were indeed blood, forensic testing could confirm whether it belonged to Carl and might provide evidence about what kind of injury or violence he had experienced. "Ewell, we need to treat this as a potential crime scene," Laramie said, making the decision to shift from search and rescue operation to criminal investigation based on evidence that was becoming increasingly difficult to explain through innocent scenarios. "I want you to mark this location with GPS coordinates and establish a perimeter. I'm going to call for additional personnel and tracking dogs. If Carl was injured or forced to move through these woods against his will, the dogs might be able to follow his scent trail to wherever he ended up." Drayton nodded and immediately began the work of securing the scene, while Laramie moved back toward an area where his radio might have enough signal strength to reach the department dispatcher and request the resources needed for an expanded search operation. The forest around them seemed to press closer as afternoon shadows lengthened, the dense canopy creating premature twilight that made navigation more difficult, and added urgency to finding Carl before darkness made the search impossible until morning. The tracking dogs arrived 2 hours later, brought by handler Sarah Mitchell from a neighboring county that maintained K-9 units trained in both law enforcement work and wilderness search operations. Mitchell's German Shepherd, a 7-year-old male named Rex, had extensive experience locating missing persons in challenging terrain and had participated in dozens of successful searches across East Texas. The dog immediately picked up Carl's scent from items Rachel had provided from their home, following a trail that led away from the clearing where the tree stand stood and deeper into forest that showed no signs of human activity or disturbance in years. The trail took them through increasingly difficult terrain, across a creek swollen by recent rains and through thickets of thorny brush that tore at clothing and made progress slow and painful. Rex moved with confident purpose that suggested Carl's scent was strong and relatively fresh. But the direction troubled Laramie because they were heading away from roads and known landmarks into sections of the timber company property that were rarely visited even by logging crews. After nearly a mile of difficult tracking, Rex suddenly stopped and began behavior that handler Mitchell immediately recognized as indicating the dog had found something significant. They emerged from heavy brush into a larger clearing that appeared to be artificial rather than natural, an area where trees had been cleared decades earlier and never replanted, leaving open ground that had been reclaimed by grass and low vegetation. But what dominated the clearing's center immediately explained why the dog had alerted, and why Carl Monroe's trail had led to this specific location. It was an old structure that had clearly been abandoned for many years, a metal building approximately 40 feet long by 20 feet wide with a rusted roof and walls that showed extensive deterioration from weather and neglect. The building's purpose wasn't immediately obvious, but its isolated location and the presence of what appeared to be heavy equipment remained scattered around the structure suggested it had been some kind of industrial facility, possibly related to logging operations or mineral extraction that had been common in East Texas during earlier decades. More significantly, the building showed signs of recent disturbance despite its obviously abandoned state. The main door, which hung partially open on damaged hinges, had fresh scratches and marks suggesting it had been forced wider recently than its deteriorated condition would normally allow. Boot prints in the soft ground around the structure matched the pattern they had been following from Carl's truck, and more troubling were the parallel tracks that indicated at least 2 people had approached the building during the same time period. Rex was focused intensely on the building's entrance, behavior that handler Mitchell interpreted as indicating Carl's scent was particularly strong in that direction, and that the dog believed the subject he was tracking was or had been inside the structure. Laramie felt every instinct that had been developed over 19 years of law enforcement warning him that they were about to discover something that would transform this case from a missing hunter investigation into something far darker and more complex. "Sarah, hold Rex here while Ewell and I check the building," Laramie instructed, drawing his service weapon and noting that Drayton had done the same based on the same assessment of a situation that felt increasingly dangerous. They approached the structure carefully, using cover and maintaining awareness of potential threats from any direction, aware that if someone was inside they could be armed and hostile. The door squealed on damaged hinges as Laramie pushed it wider, the sound unnaturally loud in the forest silence that pressed in from all directions. The interior was dark, despite afternoon light filtering through gaps in the rusted metal walls, requiring flashlights to illuminate what the building contained and explain why Carl Monroe's trail had led here and apparently ended at this location. What the flashlight beams revealed made Laramie's breath catch, and his mind struggled to process the implications of what he was seeing. The building had been converted into something that bore no resemblance to its original industrial purpose, whatever that might have been. The interior space had been divided by hanging plastic sheeting into sections that created separate areas for different purposes, and those purposes became horrifyingly clear as Laramie moved deeper into the structure. This was a slaughterhouse, but not one designed for normal meat processing. The equipment scattered throughout the building, the drainage systems built into the floor, the hooks and chains suspended from ceiling beams, all of it spoke to systematic butchering operations that had been conducted in this isolated location for purposes that Laramie's law enforcement experience told him were anything but legitimate. The smell was overwhelming, despite the building being abandoned for what appeared to be several months. The stench of old blood and decay that no amount of time or weather could fully erase from surfaces that had been saturated with biological materials over extended periods. Jesus Christ, Drayton whispered from behind Laramie, his voice tight with the same horror that Laramie was feeling. Sheriff, what is this place? The question hung in the air while they continued their cautious exploration of the building, documenting with their flashlights what would need to be photographed and processed by forensic specialists with expertise that went far beyond what a small county sheriff's department normally maintained. The plastic sheeting that divided the interior showed extensive staining and damage from whatever had been processed in this location, and the industrial-grade cutting tools scattered around the space left no doubt about the nature of activities that had occurred here. Most disturbing were personal effects that had clearly been separated from whoever they belonged to and piled in a corner of the building. Clothing, wallets, watches, wedding rings, items that spoke to individual human beings who had passed through this building under circumstances that were becoming sickeningly clear. Deputy Drayton discovered what they had both been dreading in a back section of the building where the plastic sheeting created a separate chamber that appeared to have served as temporary storage. Human remains, partially decomposed and showing clear signs of having been systematically dismembered using the industrial equipment they had seen throughout the facility. The remains were too degraded to allow immediate identification, but their presence confirmed that they were no longer investigating a missing person case. They were investigating a killing site that had apparently been used for multiple murders over an extended period, and Carl Monroe's trail leading here suggested he had either stumbled upon this location accidentally or had been deliberately led here by someone who knew about the site and its dark history. The question of whether Carl was among the remains they had discovered would require forensic analysis, but the evidence suggested they needed to expand their search of the building and surrounding area to determine the full scope of what had occurred in this isolated clearing deep in Sabine County's forests. Sheriff Hoyt Laramie had always understood that East Texas forests could swallow a man whole without leaving a trace, the dense canopy of pine and hardwood creating a twilight world where landmarks disappeared within yards and sounds echoed strangely through undergrowth thick enough to hide anything from casual observation. After 19 years serving Sabine County, a territory of deep woods and winding creeks where logging roads penetrated areas that hadn't seen human habitation since the Depression era, he thought he understood the particular dangers that came with operating in country where cell phone coverage was non-existent, and the nearest help might be hours away, even if someone knew exactly where to look. The searches he had coordinated over the years were etched into his memory with the clarity that came from cases where minutes mattered, and geography worked against every attempt to find people before exposure or injury claimed them permanently. Lost hikers who wandered off marked trails and couldn't find their way back to roads that all looked identical in forests that stretched for miles in every direction. Hunters who suffered accidents while working alone in remote stands and lay injured where no one would think to search. The occasional domestic situation that turned violent and ended with someone fleeing into woods that provided temporary sanctuary but eventually became a trap for people unprepared for the challenge of surviving without supplies or knowledge of the terrain. But nothing in Laramie's experience had prepared him for what began on a cold November morning in 2018, when a call about a missing deer hunter would lead him into darkness that had been festering in Sabine County's forests for decades, hidden among the pines where old sins had taken root and grown into something that defied easy categories of crime or investigation. The call came in at 7:15 in the morning from Rachel Monroe, whose husband Carl had failed to return from a solo hunting trip that should have concluded the previous evening. Rachel's voice carried the controlled anxiety of someone trying to remain calm while fighting against worst-case scenarios that crowded into consciousness when loved ones disappeared into wilderness areas where a dozen different accidents could turn fatal before anyone knew something was wrong. Carl had left their home near Hemphill 3 days earlier, planning to hunt a section of private land he leased from a timber company that owned vast tracts of forest throughout Sabine County. He had supplies for a week and experience that should have kept him safe in conditions that were challenging but not unusually dangerous for someone familiar with the woods and comfortable spending extended periods working alone in remote locations. Sheriff Laramie, Carl always checks in by radio every evening at 6 o'clock, just so I know he's okay, Rachel explained, her voice tight with stress that came from a full night spent waiting for contact that never came. When he didn't call last night, I figured maybe his radio batteries died or he had equipment problems. But this morning, I drove out to the access point where he parked his truck, and the vehicle is still there, but there's no sign of Carl anywhere near it. His gear looks undisturbed, like he just walked into the woods and never came back. Laramie asked the standard questions while already knowing the answers would be insufficient until he saw the situation firsthand. Had Carl mentioned specific locations where he planned to hunt? Had he experienced any health problems recently that might affect his ability to navigate or handle unexpected situations? Was there any possibility he had encountered other people in the woods who might have information about his whereabouts or what might have happened to him? Rachel's responses painted the picture of an experienced outdoorsman who had been hunting these same woods for 15 years and knew them well enough to avoid the common mistakes that claimed less experienced hunters every season. The drive to Carl Monroe's access point took 40 minutes through country that transitioned from the scattered development around Hemphill into unbroken forest that pressed close to narrow roads winding between trees that blocked direct sunlight even at midday. This was timber company land that had been logged selectively over decades, leaving a patchwork of old growth and managed forest that created the kind of complex terrain where hunting was productive, but navigation could be challenging for people who didn't maintain careful awareness of their position relative to known landmarks. Laramie brought Deputy Ewell Drayton with him, a former Army Ranger who had joined the department 5 years earlier after completing his service and returning to his hometown, seeking the kind of work that used his skills while allowing him to stay connected to the outdoor lifestyle he valued. Drayton had extensive training in wilderness tracking and search operations, making him the obvious choice for situations that required working in remote forest areas where standard law enforcement procedures needed to be adapted to environmental challenges. Carl Monroe's truck was parked exactly where Rachel had described, pulled onto a widened section of logging road that provided space for vehicles without blocking timber company access to the surrounding forest. The truck bed contained typical hunting supplies: coolers for storing game meat, ropes and pulleys for field dressing deer, and basic camping equipment that Carl apparently preferred to leave at his vehicle rather than carrying into his hunting areas. More concerning was what they found inside the truck cab: Carl's cell phone sitting on the dashboard where he had left it, knowing that coverage in these woods was non-existent and carrying the device would serve no purpose, and his wallet containing identification and emergency contact information that any experienced outdoorsman would normally carry on their person in case something happened and they needed to be identified by rescuers or medical personnel. The presence of these items suggested Carl had left them deliberately rather than forgetting them, but the reasoning behind that decision wasn't immediately clear. "Sheriff, look at this," Drayton called from where he was examining the area around the truck. "There's a clear trail heading into the woods, boot prints in the soft ground showing Carl walked in this direction. But there's something odd about the pattern." Laramie joined him to study the tracks, noting immediately what had caught Drayton's attention. The footprints showed Carl had walked into the forest with normal stride and spacing, but approximately 50 yards from the truck, the pattern changed. The prints became closer together and showed signs of hesitation, with several places where Carl had apparently stopped and shifted his weight as if observing something or considering his next move. More troubling were additional prints that appeared alongside Carl's tracks, boot impressions that were slightly larger and showed a different tread pattern than the hunting boots Carl had been wearing. Someone else had been in this area recently, and based on the way the tracks overlapped, that person had either been following Carl or had walked the same path shortly after him. "Ewell, can you tell how fresh these other tracks are?" Laramie asked, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that came with searches that started revealing unexpected complications. Drayton knelt to examine the prints more closely, using techniques Laramie had seen him employ on previous searches where reading sign was crucial to understanding what had happened in remote locations. No more than 3 or 4 days old based on how the edges have weathered and leaf debris has settled into the impressions. Whoever made these tracks was out here during the same time period Carl was hunting. Could be another hunter working nearby, or could be someone who had reason to follow Carl specifically. The possibility that Carl Monroe's disappearance involved another person rather than simple accident or misadventure changed the nature of the search and required different approaches to investigating what might have happened. They followed the tracks deeper into the forest, moving slowly to avoid disturbing evidence while also maintaining awareness of their surroundings in country, where visibility dropped to yards once you left the logging roads and entered the dense undergrowth that characterized these East Texas woods. The trail led generally northeast, following a route that took advantage of natural openings in the vegetation and avoided the thickest tangles of brush that would have slowed progress and made noise that might spook game animals. Carl had clearly been moving with purpose toward a specific destination rather than wandering randomly through the forest, suggesting he knew where he was going and had probably hunted this area before during previous trips. The presence of the second set of tracks maintaining parallel course added an element of surveillance or pursuit that made Laramie increasingly uneasy about what they might find when they located Carl or discovered why he had failed to return to his truck. After approximately half a mile, the tracks led to a small clearing where the forest canopy opened enough to allow sunlight to reach the ground and create the kind of edge habitat that attracted deer and other game animals. The clearing showed clear signs of having been used as a hunting location. A portable tree stand had been secured to a large pine on the clearing's edge, providing elevated position for observing game movements without being easily detected by animals approaching through the surrounding forest. Empty water bottles and energy bar wrappers near the base of the tree indicated Carl had spent considerable time in this location, probably waiting for deer to appear during the dawn and dusk periods when they were most active. But Carl himself was not present, and the tree stand sat empty despite being positioned for optimal hunting success. More disturbing was what they found when Drayton climbed up to examine the stand itself. Carl's rifle was still secured in the weapon rest, unfired and with a full magazine, suggesting he had not been spooked by game or forced to abandon the position because of immediate danger. "Sheriff, this doesn't make sense," Drayton called down from the stand. Why would Carl leave his rifle behind? That's not something any hunter would do voluntarily, especially not in remote country where the weapon serves as both tool and protection. Laramie agreed, feeling pieces of a disturbing pattern beginning to emerge from evidence that suggested Carl Monroe had not simply gotten lost or suffered an accident that prevented his return. The abandoned rifle, the wallet and phone left at the truck, the presence of another person's tracks following his trail, all of it pointed towards something more complex and troubling than a straightforward search and rescue operation. They needed to expand their search of the area and look for additional signs of what had happened after Carl left the tree stand, whether by choice or under circumstances that forced him to abandon his position and his primary hunting weapon. Deputy Drayton discovered the next piece of evidence approximately 100 yards beyond the clearing, partially concealed beneath a layer of fallen leaves that had accumulated in a shallow depression. It was Carl's hunting vest, the fluorescent orange garment that Texas law required hunters to wear for visibility and safety. The vest had been deliberately buried under the leaves rather than simply dropped or lost, suggesting someone had tried to conceal it and hide evidence of Carl's presence in this area. More concerning were the dark stains on the vest's fabric, discoloration that looked like blood even after exposure to weather and moisture from the forest floor. Laramie photographed the vest in place before carefully recovering it for later laboratory analysis, knowing that if the stains were indeed blood, forensic testing could confirm whether it belonged to Carl and might provide evidence about what kind of injury or violence he had experienced. "Ewell, we need to treat this as a potential crime scene," Laramie said, making the decision to shift from search and rescue operation to criminal investigation based on evidence that was becoming increasingly difficult to explain through innocent scenarios. "I want you to mark this location with GPS coordinates and establish a perimeter. I'm going to call for additional personnel and tracking dogs. If Carl was injured or forced to move through these woods against his will, the dogs might be able to follow his scent trail to wherever he ended up." Drayton nodded and immediately began the work of securing the scene, while Laramie moved back toward an area where his radio might have enough signal strength to reach the department dispatcher and request the resources needed for an expanded search operation. The forest around them seemed to press closer as afternoon shadows lengthened, the dense canopy creating premature twilight that made navigation more difficult and added urgency to finding Carl before darkness made the search impossible until morning. The tracking dogs arrived 2 hours later, brought by handler Sarah Mitchell from a neighboring county that maintained K-9 units trained in both law enforcement work and wilderness search operations. Mitchell's German Shepherd, a 7-year-old male named Rex, had extensive experience locating missing persons in challenging terrain and had participated in dozens of successful searches across East Texas. The dog immediately picked up Carl's scent from items Rachel had provided from their home, following a trail that led away from the clearing where the tree stand stood and deeper into forest that showed no signs of human activity or disturbance in years. The trail took them through increasingly difficult terrain, across a creek swollen by recent rains, and through thickets of thorny brush that tore at clothing and made progress slow and painful. Rex moved with confident purpose that suggested Carl's scent was strong and relatively fresh. But the direction troubled Laramie because they were heading away from roads and known landmarks into sections of the timber company property that were rarely visited even by logging crews. After nearly a mile of difficult tracking, Rex suddenly stopped and began behavior that handler Mitchell immediately recognized as indicating the dog had found something significant. They emerged from heavy brush into a larger clearing that appeared to be artificial rather than natural, an area where trees had been cleared decades earlier and never replanted, leaving open ground that had been reclaimed by grass and low vegetation. But what dominated the clearing's center immediately explained why the dog had alerted, and why Carl Monroe's trail had led to this specific location. It was an old structure that had clearly been abandoned for many years, a metal building approximately 40 feet long by 20 feet wide, with a rusted roof and walls that showed extensive deterioration from weather and neglect. The building's purpose wasn't immediately obvious, but its isolated location and the presence of what appeared to be heavy equipment remains scattered around the structure suggested it had been some kind of industrial facility, possibly related to logging operations or mineral extraction that had been common in East Texas during earlier decades. More significantly, the building showed signs of recent disturbance despite its obviously abandoned state. The main door, which hung partially open on damaged hinges, had fresh scratches and marks suggesting it had been forced wider recently than its deteriorated condition would normally allow. Boot prints in the soft ground around the structure matched the pattern they had been following from Carl's truck, and more troubling were the parallel tracks that indicated at least 2 people had approached the building during the same time period. Rex was focused intensely on the building's entrance, behavior that Handler Mitchell interpreted as indicating Carl's scent was particularly strong in that direction, and that the dog believed the subject he was tracking was or had been inside the structure. Laramie felt every instinct that had been developed over 19 years of law enforcement warning him that they were about to discover something that would transform this case from a missing hunter investigation into something far darker and more complex. "Sarah, hold Rex here while Ewell and I check the building," Laramie instructed, drawing his service weapon and noting that Drayton had done the same based on the same assessment of a situation that felt increasingly dangerous. They approached the structure carefully, using cover and maintaining awareness of potential threats from any direction, aware that if someone was inside they could be armed and hostile. The door squealed on damaged hinges as Laramie pushed it wider, the sound unnaturally loud in the forest silence that pressed in from all directions. The interior was dark, despite afternoon light filtering through gaps in the rusted metal walls, requiring flashlights to illuminate what the building contained and explain why Carl Monroe's trail had led here and apparently ended at this location. What the flashlight beams revealed made Laramie's breath catch, and his mind struggled to process the implications of what he was seeing. The building had been converted into something that bore no resemblance to its original industrial purpose, whatever that might have been. The interior space had been divided by hanging plastic sheeting into sections that created separate areas for different purposes, and those purposes became horrifyingly clear as Laramie moved deeper into the structure. This was a slaughterhouse, but not one designed for normal meat processing. The equipment scattered throughout the building, the drainage systems built into the floor, the hooks and chains suspended from ceiling beams, all of it spoke to systematic butchering operations that had been conducted in this isolated location for purposes that Laramie's law enforcement experience told him were anything but legitimate. The smell was overwhelming despite the building being abandoned for what appeared to be several months. The stench of old blood and decay that no amount of time or weather could fully erase from surfaces that had been saturated with biological materials over extended periods. "Jesus Christ," Drayton whispered from behind Laramie, his voice tight with the same horror that Laramie was feeling. "Sheriff, what is this place?" The question hung in the air while they continued their cautious exploration of the building, documenting with their flashlights what would need to be photographed and processed by forensic specialists with expertise that went far beyond what a small county sheriff's department normally maintained. The plastic sheeting that divided the interior showed extensive staining and damage from whatever had been processed in this location, and the industrial-grade cutting tools scattered around the space left no doubt about the nature of activities that had occurred here. Most disturbing were personal effects that had clearly been separated from whoever they belonged to and piled in a corner of the building. Clothing, wallets, watches, wedding rings, items that spoke to individual human beings who had passed through this building under circumstances that were becoming sickeningly clear. Deputy Drayton discovered what they had both been dreading in a back section of the building where the plastic sheeting created a separate chamber that appeared to have served as temporary storage. Human remains, partially decomposed, and showing clear signs of having been systematically dismembered using the industrial equipment they had seen throughout the facility. The remains were too degraded to allow immediate identification, but their presence confirmed that they were no longer investigating a missing person case. They were investigating a killing site that had apparently been used for multiple murders over an extended period, and Carl Monroe's trail leading here suggested he had either stumbled upon this location accidentally or had been deliberately led here by someone who knew about the site and its dark history. The question of whether Carl was among the remains they had discovered would require forensic analysis, but the evidence suggested they needed to expand their search of the building and surrounding area to determine the full scope of what had occurred in this isolated clearing deep in Sabine County's forests. The tactical operation to rescue Carl Monroe began at 5:30 in the morning, when darkness still blanketed the East Texas forest and the only sounds were the distant calls of owls finishing their nocturnal hunting before dawn drove them back to roost. Sheriff Laramie had insisted on participating in the operation, despite Lieutenant Sullivan's concerns about involving local law enforcement in what was essentially a hostage rescue that carried significant risk of violence and casualties. Laramie's argument had been simple and impossible to refute. Carl Monroe was a Sabine County resident who had disappeared while engaged in lawful activities on land within his jurisdiction, and as the elected sheriff responsible for protecting the county's citizens, he had both legal authority and moral obligation to be present when attempts were made to recover someone who had been taken by criminals operating in his territory. Sullivan had ultimately agreed, positioning Laramie with the command element that would coordinate the operation from a staging area approximately 200 yards from the cabin where Vernon Hayes claimed Carl was being held. The property where the cabin sat was accessed by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest for nearly 3 miles before reaching a clearing that had been carved from surrounding woods decades earlier. The cabin itself was a simple structure that appeared to date from the 1950s or 60s, built as a hunting camp or weekend retreat and maintained minimally over the years to provide basic shelter without attracting attention through extensive improvements or regular activity. Hayes had described the layout based on his limited visits to the location: a single-room cabin with a small porch, a separate storage shed approximately 50 feet from the main structure, and an outhouse that indicated the property lacked running water or modern utilities. The isolation was complete, with no nearby residences and no reason for anyone to travel the access road unless they specifically intended to visit this property. It was exactly the kind of location that criminal operations valued for conducting activities that required absolute privacy and freedom from unexpected observation by law enforcement or curious civilians. The tactical team approached through the forest surrounding the clearing, moving with practiced silence through undergrowth that would betray hasty movement with noise that could alert anyone maintaining watch at the cabin. Thermal imaging equipment had been deployed during the night to determine how many people were present at the location, revealing heat signatures that indicated at least 3 individuals inside the cabin and possibly a 4th in the storage shed. The number matched what Vernon Hayes had estimated, based on how many of Thomas Garrett's associates typically participated in security operations when high-value prisoners or materials needed to be guarded. The tactical plan called for simultaneous assault on both structures once teams were in position, with the primary objective being to secure Carl Monroe and prevent anyone from harming him during the confusion that would follow when law enforcement presence was revealed. Secondary objectives included capturing Thomas Garrett and his associates alive if possible, both to face prosecution for their crimes and to provide information about the full scope of the criminal network that extended beyond Sabine County. As dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon and the forest transitioned from complete darkness to the gray, pre-dawn illumination that marked the period when nocturnal animals retreated and diurnal creatures began to stir, the tactical team leader gave the signal to initiate the operation. Flashbang grenades were deployed at the cabin's entrance and windows simultaneously, creating disorientation and temporary incapacitation that would allow entry teams to secure the interior before occupants could effectively resist or harm any prisoners being held inside. The explosions shattered the morning silence with violence that sent birds erupting from nearby trees and created the kind of shock effect that had proven effective in countless hostage rescue operations. Entry teams breached the cabin door and windows within seconds of the flashbangs detonating, their movements practiced and coordinated through training that emphasized speed and overwhelming force to prevent hostage takers from implementing contingency plans that typically involved killing prisoners rather than allowing them to be rescued. The cabin's interior confirmed Vernon Hayes' description, while also revealing the grim reality of what Carl Monroe had endured during his captivity. The single room had been divided by a curtain into a living area where Garrett's men maintained watch, and a makeshift cell where Carl was chained to a support beam that ran from floor to ceiling. Carl was alive, but showed clear signs of abuse and deprivation. Extensive bruising that indicated he had been beaten repeatedly, dehydration severe enough to require immediate medical intervention, and the hollow expression of someone who had spent days expecting death and had lost hope of rescue. The 3 men present in the cabin were secured without resistance once they recovered from the flashbang disorientation, their weapons confiscated and their persons restrained with zip ties while medics attended to Carl. None of the captured men was Thomas Garrett, which meant the operation's primary target was either in the storage shed or had not been present at the property during the raid. Deputy Drayton led the team that cleared the storage shed, finding it empty except for supplies and equipment related to maintaining prisoners at the remote location. The absence of Garrett created immediate concern that he had either been warned about the impending operation or had simply not been present when tactical teams arrived. The captured men were refusing to answer questions about Garrett's location or activities, following the standard criminal protocol of remaining silent until legal representation could be arranged and plea negotiations could begin. Lieutenant Sullivan made the decision to transport all prisoners back to the Sheriff's Department for processing while also issuing alerts to law enforcement agencies throughout East Texas to watch for Garrett and detain him if located. The concern was that once he learned about the raid on the cabin and the rescue of Carl Monroe, Garrett would either flee the region or take action to destroy evidence and eliminate anyone who might provide testimony about his role in operating the slaughterhouse network. Carl Monroe was transported to the regional hospital in Lufkin, where doctors evaluated his condition and began treatment for injuries and deprivation that had nearly killed him during his captivity. Sheriff Laramie accompanied him in the ambulance, wanting to be present when Carl was stable enough to provide a statement about what had happened from the time he discovered the slaughterhouse facility until he was rescued from the cabin where Garrett's men had been holding him. The medical evaluation revealed that, beyond the obvious signs of physical abuse, Carl had been systematically deprived of adequate food and water as part of what appeared to be interrogation aimed at determining whether he had shared information about the slaughterhouse with anyone before his capture. The fact that he had survived suggested either remarkable physical resilience or a calculation by his captors that keeping him alive provided some advantage that would be lost if he was killed immediately. When Carl was finally able to speak coherently, his account of events filled in crucial details about what had occurred during the 3 days between his discovery of the slaughterhouse and the moment when Vernon Hayes and Thomas Garrett's men had captured him at his tree stand. According to Carl, he had been hunting in his usual area when he noticed vehicle tracks that shouldn't have been present on the timber company land where public access was limited to people who had leases or permits for specific activities. Following the tracks out of curiosity and concern that illegal activity might be occurring in areas where he had invested time and money to establish hunting locations, he had discovered the slaughterhouse building and had immediately recognized that whatever was happening there was criminal in nature. The industrial equipment, the smell of death that permeated the structure, and the presence of personal effects that clearly belonged to multiple individuals convinced him that he had stumbled onto something that required immediate reporting to law enforcement. I took photographs and video to document what I found, thinking I would drive back to town and bring Sheriff Laramie out to see the site. Carl explained, his voice weak but steady as he described decisions that had nearly cost him his life. But before I could leave the area, I saw a truck approaching on the access road, and I realized I needed to hide because whoever was coming might be connected to the facility. I watched from concealment as 2 men arrived and began unloading equipment from the truck, and I made the mistake of taking more photographs instead of leaving immediately while I had the chance. The men had apparently detected his presence, either through noise he made while photographing them or through some kind of security system that alerted them to unauthorized activity near the slaughterhouse. They had pursued him through the forest back toward his tree stand, catching him before he could reach his truck and escape the area with the evidence he had collected. Thomas Garrett had been one of the men who captured Carl, and according to Carl's description, Garrett had immediately understood the threat that a witness with photographic evidence represented to the entire criminal network. He told me that I had seen things that couldn't be unseen, and that the only question now was how much damage I would cause before they dealt with me permanently. He took my camera and checked the images, and when he saw what I had documented, he made calls to other people who apparently needed to be consulted about how to handle the situation. Carl had been transported to the cabin and held there while Garrett and his associates debated whether to kill him immediately or attempt to determine if he had shared information about the slaughterhouse with anyone before his capture. The interrogation had been brutal, involving physical abuse and psychological torture designed to break his resistance and force him to reveal whether Rachel or anyone else knew about his discovery. I told them nothing because there was nothing to tell, Carl continued, his voice breaking as he described the worst moments of his captivity. I hadn't contacted anyone between finding the facility and being captured, so Rachel and the authorities had no idea what I had discovered or why I had disappeared. But Garrett didn't believe me, kept insisting that I must have shared the information, and that my cooperation in revealing who knew would determine whether I died quickly or suffered for days before they killed me. The sustained interrogation had continued until the morning of the rescue, with Garrett's men maintaining constant watch to prevent any escape attempt, while also ensuring that Carl remained alive pending final decisions about his disposal. The fact that Vernon Hayes had provided information about the cabin's location as part of his cooperation agreement had saved Carl's life, though the psychological trauma of what he had endured would require extensive treatment beyond the physical injuries that doctors were addressing. The investigation into Thomas Garrett's current location consumed law enforcement resources across East Texas, as agencies coordinated efforts to locate and apprehend a man who now understood that his criminal network had been exposed, and his only options were flight or capture. The captured associates from the cabin had eventually begun cooperating after being confronted with evidence of their participation in Carl Monroe's captivity, and after prosecutors offered plea agreements that provided incentives for testimony against higher-level operators in the criminal enterprise. Their information revealed that Garrett had multiple safe houses and properties scattered across Texas and Louisiana where he could hide while determining his next moves, and that he had significant financial resources available to fund extended flight from law enforcement. More troubling was information suggesting that Garrett had contacts within law enforcement agencies who had provided warnings about investigations in the past, raising concerns about whether he might receive advance notice of efforts to locate him. The breakthrough that would lead to Garrett's capture came from an unexpected source 3 days after the cabin raid, when Bertie Sloan, a local woman who lived on property adjacent to one of Vernon Hayes' parcels, contacted Sheriff Laramie with information she had been reluctant to share earlier. Bertie was in her 70s, a widow who had lived alone in the forest for decades after her husband's death, and who maintained a careful distance from her neighbors while also observing their activities with the attention that came from spending most of her time at home with little else to occupy her attention. She had noticed unusual activity at what she now knew was the slaughterhouse property over the years, including late-night vehicle traffic and the presence of people who clearly weren't engaging in normal hunting or recreational activities in the forest. She had never reported what she observed because she minded her own business as a matter of principle, and because she had learned that asking questions about other people's activities in remote East Texas could create problems for people who valued their privacy and isolation. Sheriff Laramie, I probably should have spoken up years ago, but I didn't want trouble, and I convinced myself that whatever was happening wasn't my concern, Bertie said, when Laramie visited her small home to hear what information she could provide. But after reading about that poor hunter who was taken and about all those people who were killed at that facility, I can't stay quiet anymore. I know where Thomas Garrett has been hiding since your raid on the cabin, and I know he's planning to leave the area within the next day or two. According to Bertie, Garrett owned property approximately 5 miles from her home that he had purchased years earlier under a business name that concealed his personal ownership. The property included an old house that Garrett had renovated for use as a secure retreat where he could stay without attracting attention from neighbors or law enforcement. Bertie had seen Garrett's vehicle at the property the night after the cabin raid and had noticed lights and activity suggesting he was preparing for departure rather than planning to remain in the area long term. Sheriff Laramie immediately coordinated with Lieutenant Sullivan and Texas Rangers to plan an operation to capture Garrett at the property Bertie had identified, knowing that this might be their only opportunity to apprehend him before he fled to locations where finding him would be significantly more difficult. The tactical approach would need to be different from the cabin raid because Garrett was alone and likely heavily armed, aware that law enforcement was searching for him and prepared to resist arrest violently rather than allow himself to be taken into custody. The property layout that Bertie described included the main house, a detached garage where Garrett kept his vehicle, and surrounding forests that provided multiple escape routes if he detected law enforcement approach and decided to flee on foot. The operation would require careful coordination and patience, waiting for the right moment when Garrett was vulnerable and unable to effectively resist or escape before tactical teams revealed their presence. The surveillance of Garrett's property began that evening, with undercover officers positioned at locations that provided visual coverage of the main house and access road, while remaining concealed from anyone observing from the property. The waiting was tense and uncomfortable, conducted in cold November weather that made hours of motionless observation physically challenging, while also requiring absolute silence and stillness to avoid detection by a suspect who would be watching for exactly the kind of law enforcement activity that would indicate his location had been compromised. Laramie maintained command from a position that allowed radio communication with all surveillance teams, while also giving him visual access to the property through equipment that would detect any movement or activity suggesting Garrett was preparing to depart. The night passed slowly with only minimal activity visible at the house. Occasional lights indicating Garrett was awake and moving around inside, but not apparently preparing for immediate departure. The decision to initiate the capture operation came at dawn when thermal imaging detected Garrett moving from the house to the garage where his vehicle was stored, behavior that suggested he was indeed planning to leave the property and beginning preparations for departure. Lieutenant Sullivan gave the order for tactical teams to move into position surrounding both structures, with the primary objective being to prevent Garrett from reaching his vehicle and attempting to flee by road. The secondary consideration was to avoid giving Garrett opportunity to barricade himself inside the house where he could resist for extended periods, while also potentially destroying evidence that might be present at the property. The operation required speed and coordination to eliminate Garrett's options before he fully understood that law enforcement had him surrounded and that resistance or flight would be futile. The tactical teams approached rapidly once the order was given, using the forest cover to close distance before revealing their presence through commands ordering Garrett to surrender and exit the garage with his hands visible. The response was immediate and violent, with Garrett firing multiple shots from inside the garage in the direction of the officers announcing their presence. The gunfire forced tactical teams to take cover and initiate protocols for dealing with an armed, barricaded suspect who had demonstrated willingness to use deadly force against law enforcement. Lieutenant Sullivan immediately established communication with Garrett through a speaker system, attempting to negotiate surrender and avoid a prolonged standoff that could result in casualties on either side. Garrett's responses made clear that he had no intention of surrendering peacefully, stating that he understood capture meant spending the rest of his life in prison, and that he preferred to die in a shootout rather than face that outcome. The standoff continued for over an hour, with Garrett periodically firing shots to keep law enforcement at distance, while Sullivan worked to establish some kind of rapport that might lead to negotiated surrender. The tactical advantage clearly belonged to law enforcement, with overwhelming numbers and the ability to wait indefinitely, while Garrett's options steadily diminished as time passed and his ammunition supply depleted. But the psychological profile of someone willing to operate a facility where dozens of people had been murdered over years suggested Garrett might be prepared to fight until killed rather than accept the legal consequences of his crimes. The situation was approaching a point where tactical teams would need to make the decision to assault the garage and accept the risks of casualties in order to end the standoff and prevent Garrett from potentially taking his own life before he could be interrogated about the full scope of his criminal network. The resolution came suddenly when Garrett apparently made the calculation that he had no realistic chance of escape or survival through continued resistance. He emerged from the garage with his weapon lowered but still in his hands, a posture that forced tactical teams to maintain their weapons trained on him while also providing opportunity for him to fully surrender if he chose to do so. The seconds that followed were among the most tense of Sheriff Laramie's career as he watched through binoculars from the command position, waiting to see whether Garrett would drop his weapon and submit to arrest or would make some final violent gesture that would force officers to fire and potentially kill him before he could be taken into custody. The moment stretched impossibly long before Garrett finally released his grip on the weapon and allowed it to fall to the ground, raising his hands in the universal gesture of surrender that indicated he had accepted the inevitability of capture and the legal process that would follow. Thomas Garrett was taken into custody without further incident and transported to the Sabine County Sheriff's Department, where he would undergo interrogation about his role in operating the slaughterhouse facility and the criminal network that had sustained operations for over a decade. The search of his property revealed extensive documentation of criminal activities, including financial records that showed the scope of revenues generated through the illegal trade in human remains, communications with clients who had purchased materials processed at the facility, and most significantly detailed records of victims who had been taken and killed over the 12 years since the operation began. The records confirmed what forensic investigators had suspected based on evidence recovered from the slaughterhouse and burial sites. Garrett's network had been responsible for the deaths of at least 43 people across East Texas and neighboring states, making it one of the most extensive serial killing operations in the region's history. The interrogation of Thomas Garrett provided insights into the psychology of someone who could systematically murder dozens of people while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business activities and normal social relationships. Garrett showed no remorse for his crimes, instead describing the operation in clinical terms that emphasized financial success and operational efficiency while completely dehumanizing the victims who had been processed through his facility. According to Garrett's account, he had identified a market demand for human biological materials that legitimate sources could not or would not supply, and had created a business model that efficiently acquired raw materials through abduction, processed them using equipment and techniques adapted from legitimate meat processing operations, and distributed finished products to clients who paid premium prices for materials that could not be obtained through legal channels. The victims had been selected based on careful analysis of who could be taken without generating immediate law enforcement attention, with preference for people whose disappearances would be attributed to accidents or voluntary departure, rather than triggering investigations that might eventually compromise the operation. I treated it as a business problem that required systematic solution, Garrett explained during one interrogation session, his voice devoid of emotion as he described activities that had resulted in 43 deaths. Every business has inputs, processes, and outputs that need to be optimized for profitability and sustainability. The fact that my inputs were human beings was simply a characteristic of the market I was serving, no different than any other commodity that requires acquisition and processing before distribution. The complete absence of moral consideration or emotional response to the suffering his activities had caused made Garrett's testimony deeply disturbing for investigators who were accustomed to criminals showing at least some recognition that they had harmed others. Garrett appeared to genuinely view his operations as business ventures that happened to involve killing people, a perspective that psychiatrists would later identify as consistent with extreme antisocial personality disorder and psychopathic traits that allowed him to function normally in social contexts while conducting activities that most people would find utterly horrifying. The prosecution of Thomas Garrett and his associates would take years to complete, as the full scope of their criminal network was documented and cases were built for trial. Garrett faced multiple capital murder charges that carried the death penalty in Texas, along with numerous additional charges related to kidnapping, operating a criminal enterprise, and disposal of human remains. Vernon Hayes received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, though he would still spend decades in prison for his role in the operation. The other associates captured at the cabin and identified through subsequent investigation also faced serious charges that would result in lengthy prison sentences. For the families of victims who had been missing for years without explanation, the resolution of the investigation provided some measure of closure, though learning the circumstances of their loved ones' deaths was traumatic in ways that no legal process could fully address.